Every world carries questions that live just beneath its surface, waiting quietly for someone patient enough to listen. The Pokemon world is no different, layered with wonders that stretch far beyond what any single journey could uncover. There are creatures whose bodies hold secrets that science has only begun to understand, and places where the laws of nature seem to bend gently around something older and stranger than ordinary explanation. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The mysteries explored here are drawn entirely from what the games, the lore, and the natural world have shown us. Nothing invented, nothing exaggerated, only the remarkable truths already hidden inside a world you thought you knew. The Pokemon world holds its mysteries gently, not loudly. They do not announce themselves with dramatic music or sudden revelations. They surface slowly, the way a question forms at the edge of a dream, present before you realize it has arrived. There are things that cannot be fully explained by typing charts or move descriptions. There are behaviors that researchers within the world itself have spent lifetimes cataloging without resolution. And there are creatures whose existence raises questions that the games have never fully answered. Questions that hang in the air long after the credits have rolled. The relationship between Pokemon and sleep has never been simple. Drowsy and Hypno are perhaps the most widely studied examples of sleep-related Pokemon, and what the Pokédex reveals about them is genuinely unsettling when examined slowly. Drowsy is said to have originated from a tapir, an animal long associated in Japanese folklore with the eating of dreams. The Baku, a creature from that same tradition, was believed to devour nightmares before they could take hold in the sleeping mind. Drowsy does not merely cause sleep. According to multiple Pokédex entries across different generations, it smells the dreams of sleeping people from far away, seeking out those with particularly sweet or pleasant dreams. The sweetness of a dream, apparently, determines its appeal, the way a ripe piece of fruit draws something hungry from a distance. This detail is small, but it shifts the nature of the creature entirely. It is not simply a psychic Pokemon that puts things to sleep. It is a being with aesthetic preferences about the dreams it consumes. Hypno carries that complexity even further. Its pendulum, swinging with a soft and hypnotic rhythm, is not merely a tool. Pokédex entries have noted that Hypno sometimes becomes so absorbed in its own swinging that it puts itself into a trance. A creature designed to manipulate the boundaries between waking and dreaming occasionally loses those boundaries itself. There is something quietly poignant in that, the idea of a being whose greatest power is also its greatest vulnerability. What makes the Taper connection so interesting is what it suggests about how the Pokemon world understands the relationship between animals and the unconscious. In the waking world, tapirs are large, shy herbivores who live in tropical forests and have changed very little in the last 30 million years. They are ancient in a way that feels prehistoric, as if they belong to an earlier version of the planet. The folklore that grew up around them speaks to something people sensed in their quiet, unhurried presence. Drowsy inherits that antiquity, that sense of something that has existed long enough to understand sleep in ways that younger creatures cannot. There is a region of Pokemon lore that touches on this same ancient quality in a different way. The Pokemon Jirachi is said to wake for 7 days every 1,000 years, spending the rest of its existence in deep slumber, wrapped inside a cocooning material called a wishing star. During those 7 days of wakefulness, it is said to grant wishes. The mathematics of this are worth sitting with quietly. 7 days of awareness for every 1,000 years of sleep means that Jirachi has spent the vast majority of its existence in a state between consciousness and something deeper. Its waking life, accumulated across all of time, would amount to only a tiny fraction of its total existence, and yet it is considered a being of extraordinary power and benevolence. This raises a question that the games never answer directly. What happens to Jirachi during those thousands of years of sleep? The lore describes the wishing star as a place where people concentrate their hopes and desires, where the accumulated weight of human longing becomes something dense enough to be physical. Is Jirachi simply unconscious, Or is it doing something during that long, dark stretch that we do not have words for? Is it listening, even in sleep, to the wishes that accumulate around it? There is no definitive answer, only the quiet resonance of the question itself. The Pokemon Muna and Musherna carry this dream world connection in a different register. Muna floats through the air, eating the dreams of sleeping people and Pokemon alike, releasing dream smoke that takes the shape of the dreams it has consumed. What makes this particularly interesting is that Muna does not appear to distinguish between pleasant dreams and nightmares. It consumes both. The dream smoke it releases can take any form, joyful or frightening, depending entirely on what the dreamer was experiencing. Musherna, its evolution, produces a thicker, more concentrated version of this smoke, and the shapes within it are said to be more vivid and more stable, lasting longer before they dissolve. There is something almost archival about that. Musherna drifting through a darkened room with faint shapes curling from its forehead, shapes that once existed only inside someone else's sleeping mind. Each dissipating image is a small loss. Each new one is a small intimacy. The creature carries other people's inner lives as a byproduct of its own nourishment, and the world it leaves behind is briefly, gently haunted by those interior landscapes. The question of time is one that the Pokemon world handles with unusual care. There are creatures whose relationship to time is so strange, so fundamentally different from ordinary experience, that understanding them requires setting aside familiar assumptions about how time is supposed to work. Celebi is perhaps the most quietly profound example. It travels through time freely, appearing in different eras without apparent effort or distress. The lore surrounding Celebi describes lush forests that have been visited by it across many different time periods, forests where the presence of Celebi is said to leave the plants unusually vibrant and long-lived. This suggests that Celebi's passage through time leaves something behind, some residual vitality that accumulates in the places it has repeatedly touched. But what does it mean to travel through time freely? Most thinking about time travel involves paradoxes, the danger of changing the past in ways that alter the future, the possibility of encountering earlier or later versions of yourself. Celebi seems to move through these concerns without being troubled by them. It visits the same forests across different centuries, and the forests grow more vital, not more confused. Its presence is generative rather than disruptive. This suggests that the version of time the Pokemon world operates within is fundamentally different from the closed loops and branching timelines most often imagined, a time that is perhaps more like a river than a maze, one that absorbs new arrivals without fracturing. Dialga's relationship to time is of an entirely different quality. It is not a traveler, but a sovereign, described in the lore of the Sinnoh region as the being whose heartbeat regulates the flow of time itself. This is an extraordinary claim. It means that time, as experienced by every creature in the Pokemon world, is not a background condition, not a feature of the universe's architecture, but something that depends on the continued existence and steady rhythm of a single living being. If Dialga were to stop, time would stop. If Dialga's heart beat faster, time would accelerate. The cosmos, in this understanding, is biologically dependent. The Sinnoh myths that surround Dialga frame this in language that is appropriately vast and serious. The creation of the world in those stories begins with Arceus, a being that exists before existence itself, shaping reality from nothing. From that act of creation, Dialga and Palkia emerge, given dominion over time and space respectively, and their ongoing presence sustains the framework within which all other life unfolds. Giratina, the third of these beings, was driven into a mirror dimension for its violent nature, where it became the ruler of a distorted world that exists alongside the ordinary one, touching it at strange angles. What is quietly remarkable about this mythology is how it handles the question of origin. Arceus created the world, but where did Arceus come from? The myths do not answer this. They allow the question to remain open, not as an oversight, but seemingly as an intentional acknowledgement that some things exist before explanation. There is a humility in that, a willingness to say that even the most complete cosmology has an edge, a place where the story simply begins without accounting for what preceded it. Palkia's dominion over space carries its own mystery. Space, in physics, is not simply the emptiness between objects, but a structure with its own properties, curvable, expandable, potentially folded in ways that allow distant points to touch. Palkia is described in the lore as being able to warp space freely, and its appearance, a large creature with pearlescent wings and a body that seems partially composed of spatial distortion itself, reflects this connection. The Pokemon lore does not elaborate on how Palkia's manipulation of space affects the ordinary inhabitants of the world. Presumably, they do not feel their towns briefly folding or their roots stretching when Palkia moves through the world. But the possibility is there, sleeping quietly beneath the surface of every ordinary day. The relationship between Pokemon and human emotion is one of the deeper mysteries threading through every game and generation. The Pokemon world is not a place where the natural and the emotional are separate. They are woven together in ways that become more apparent the closer you look. Gardevoir is perhaps the most studied example of this weaving. Its Pokédex entries describe it as capable of sensing the emotions of its trainer from a great distance, reading shifts in mood the way a sailor reads weather from subtle changes in the wind. But the entries go further than that. Gardevoir is said to be willing to distort the very fabric of space to protect a trainer it is loyal to, and the energy it uses to do this comes from its own life force. It will give its life for a trainer's safety, not as an act of programming, but as something closer to love, with all the complexity and cost that love actually carries. What makes this interesting from a mystery standpoint is what it implies about Gardevoir's inner life. A being capable of genuine loyalty, genuine sacrifice, must have something that makes those concepts meaningful. There must be an interior experience, a sense of self that can be given up, a sense of value that can be assigned to something outside that self. Gardevoir is not the only Pokemon with complex emotional capacities, but its entries state these capacities most directly, with a clarity that invites questions rather than closing them. Tokus is described as a bringer of good news and blessing, appearing only in places where people are living in peace and kindness, and never appearing in places where conflict or cruelty is present. The mystery here is subtle. How does Togekiss know? What sense does it use to detect the emotional quality of a place before arriving? It is not described as a psychic Pokemon in the way Alakazam or Gardevoir are. It does not read individual minds. It reads something more diffuse, something more like atmosphere, the accumulated emotional residue of how people have been treating each other. This suggests a form of perception we have no parallel for, an awareness of collective emotional history somehow encoded in the air or the light or the texture of a place. Blissey takes this emotional sensitivity in yet another direction. Its entries describe it as being so attuned to sadness that it will rush to comfort anyone who is crying, and that anyone who eats the egg it offers will become warm and gentle. The egg functions here not just as nutrition, but as a kind of emotional medicine, carrying within it properties that soften hard feelings. The lore is careful not to frame this as magic in the supernatural sense. It is presented as a natural property of a natural creature, the way certain plants have medicinal properties, not because they are enchanted, but because their chemistry happens to interact with human biology in healing ways. But the result is something that blurs the line between the physical and the emotional in a way that feels genuinely mysterious. The Pokemon Absol presents a different and more complicated relationship between creature and emotion. Absol is described as a Pokemon that appears before disasters, and as a result has been feared and misunderstood for most of its recorded history. People see Absol and assume it brings disaster, not realizing that it arrives to warn rather than to cause. The tragedy in this is specific and quiet. A being whose purpose is compassion has become universally associated with dread, not because it has done anything wrong, but because its appearance and the events that follow have been misread for generations. What Absol's entries reveal about the world is that it has senses extending far beyond ordinary perception. It can detect approaching calamity, whether natural disaster or human conflict, through some sensitivity in its body and mind that registers conditions invisible to other creatures. The curved blade on its face is not a weapon, but an instrument of some kind, tuned to frequencies of coming change. There is something almost lonely in this image. Absol wandering remote mountains, reading signs of approaching catastrophe, descending into populated areas to warn people who cannot understand what it is trying to tell them, and then watching as its very arrival is mistaken for the danger it came to prevent. The ocean of the Pokemon world holds more mystery per cubic meter than perhaps any other part of the setting. Water covers the majority of the world's surface, and the creatures that live there exist in conditions so different from those on land that they might as well inhabit a separate reality. The deepest parts of the Pokemon ocean have never been fully explored, and the creatures that live there reveal things about biology, perception, and survival that the surface world has no equivalent for. Wailord, one of the largest Pokemon ever documented, has a body density so low relative to its enormous size that it is actually one of the least dense creatures known. This is not a trivial detail. It means that Wailord's vast bulk is composed largely of air and very lightweight material, a floating architecture of bones and chambers that allows something of tremendous size to exist without the crushing metabolic demands that size would normally impose. Real blue whales solve the same problem in similar ways. Their bodies are supported by water, and their mass is distributed through a structural system that has been refined over millions of years. Wailord seems to follow this same logic, but pushed to even greater extremes. Wailord is also notable for its migrations. The entries describe herds of Wailord leaping from the ocean's surface, breaching in patterns that researchers have never fully decoded. The scale of these leaps, given Wailord's size, is almost incomprehensible, something the size of a building rising entirely out of the water and briefly becoming airborne. Whether this behavior is communicative, recreational, or related to some biological need that has not yet been identified remains an open question. Relicanth is one of the Pokemon world's oldest surviving species, described as having remained essentially unchanged for 100 million years. This places its origin in a period before most of the familiar life on land had even evolved. What Relicanth has been doing during all of that time, what it has witnessed, what adaptations it has quietly maintained across geological epochs while the world around it transformed beyond recognition, is a question the games gesture toward but never fully explore. Its stone-like scales are dense enough to withstand the crushing pressure of deep ocean trenches. Its body structure is suited for the cold, lightless deep where it spends most of its existence. It surfaces rarely, and when it does, it seems barely aware of the world above. The mystery of Relicanth is not in what it does, but in what it represents. A living record of a world almost entirely lost, a body that has been working the same way for longer than most mountain ranges have existed. There is something humbling in looking at it, the sense that on geological timescales, the things that seem permanent to us, civilizations, species, the arrangement of continents, are ephemeral, and only something very small and very patient can outlast them all. Kyogre's mythology positions it at the origin point of the oceans themselves. The ancient lore of the Hone region describes Kyogre as the entity that expanded the seas to cover the world, clashing in ancient times with Groudon, who raised the continents from the water. This clash was so violent, so fundamental to the shaping of the world, that neither could be permitted to complete what it had begun. The intervention of Rayquaza, a being of the upper atmosphere, was required to separate them and drive them into slumber. The world we inhabit is the result of that stalemate, a balance between the sea's desire to spread and the land's desire to rise, held in tension by the memory of a conflict ancient enough that no living creature witnessed it. What makes this mythology interesting as a mystery is what it implies about the present state of Kyogre and Groudon. They did not die. They sleep, waiting, and the conditions of the world remain stable only as long as they continue sleeping. The ocean that covers most of the surface is not simply a geological feature. It is the residue of a being's ambition, frozen in time by the intervention of something even older. Every wave is, in some small sense, a continuation of Kyogre's ancient purpose, still pressing outward at the edges of the world. Ghost-type Pokémon exist at the edge of an enormous question. What happens after death? In the Pokemon, the games approach this question carefully, allowing it to be present without fully answering it, and the creatures associated with it carry the weight of that ambiguity in ways that reward slow attention. Gengar is described in Pokédex entries as the shadow of Clefable, though this connection has never been fully explained or confirmed within the games. The visual resemblance is obvious, the rounded body, the wide grin, the small limbs, but whether Gengar is literally the ghost of a Clefable, or whether both creatures simply evolved from a similar visual archetype for different reasons, is deliberately left unclear. What the entries do consistently say is that Gengar lowers the temperature of the air around it dramatically, to the point where people nearby are said to feel a sudden chill that triggers an instinctive sense of being watched. This chilling effect is not described as a psychic projection or an intimidation strategy. It simply happens, the way certain chemical reactions release cold as a byproduct. Gengar's presence lowers temperature because of something fundamental to what Gengar is, not because of anything it is trying to do. Shedinja's origins are genuinely strange. When Nincada evolves into Ninjask, it leaves behind a shed exoskeleton. Under certain conditions, that exoskeleton becomes Shedinja, a creature with no apparent biological processes, no discernible heartbeat or respiration, and a single hollow in its back that should not be looked into. The Pokédex entries about what happens if someone looks into that hollow are consistent across multiple games. Something takes the soul. The hollow does not reveal a creature inside Shedinja waiting to claim you. It simply empties you of something vital. What kind of being is Shedinja? It is not a ghost in the conventional sense. It did not die to become what it is. It is a shell that became inhabited by something that entered through the empty space left by a departing spirit. It exists on Wonder Guard, impervious to almost every form of damage, not because it is tough, but because it barely exists physically at all. There is almost nothing there to harm. The Pokemon that are capable of hurting Shedinja are those whose attacks work not on the physical body, but on something more fundamental. Fire that burns essence rather than material, something that can find and damage the very little that remains. Chandelure presents another mystery. It is described as drawing out and consuming the spirit of opponents rather than their physical body, leaving them as empty husks that wander without purpose or direction. The souls it consumes are said to dance inside the flames that comprise its body, unable to move on, trapped in the light of something that extinguished them. What happens to a person or Pokemon left as an empty husk by Chandelure is not described in detail. The entries acknowledge the husk, but do not follow it. Does it eventually recover? Does it simply stop functioning without whatever animated it? The mystery is allowed to remain open, which may be the kindest thing the games can do. Frozlass is the ghost of a woman who died in the mountain. Transformed by exposure to cold so extreme, it preserved her into something that is no longer entirely material. Her Pokédex entries note that she freezes prey and keeps the frozen forms as decorations in her den. Whether any of these frozen forms were once people, the entries do not specify. The implication is present, held just below the surface, in the same way that the cold she carries sits just below the temperature at which things stop moving permanently. What the ghost-type Pokemon as a group reveal about the Pokemon world is that death is not an endpoint. It is a transition into a different state, one that still permits presence in the world, still permits still permits something that resembles feeling and desire, and even, in some cases, humor. Haunter is playful. Gengar is mischievous. They do not behave like beings in agony. They behave like beings who have found in their transformed state something to be curious and amused by. Death in the Pokemon world seems, from the outside, less final than it appears in other contexts, though whether this makes it less serious is a question the games wisely decline to answer. The mountains and volcanic regions of the Pokemon world harbor mysteries of a geological and primal kind, creatures whose existence is intertwined with the deep processes of the earth itself. These are not gentle mystery. They are the kind that move slowly and speak in pressures and temperatures that ordinary life cannot withstand. Heatran is a being born from the volcanic activity of a specific mountain, described as having been formed when the iron of the earth was fused into a living creature by heat and pressure so extreme that they cross some threshold into biology. Its legs are described as being able to melt through rock, not because it chooses to destroy, but because it is physically incompatible with ordinary solid material. The ground does not hold it the way it holds other creatures. It sinks slightly wherever it stands, leaving traces of its passing in the stone itself. What makes Heatran fascinating as a mystery is the question of its origin. How does a creature come into being from geological processes? Biology as we understand it requires specific conditions, specific chemistry, specific temperatures within a very narrow range. Everything about Heatran's existence violates those requirements. It is alive in conditions where life should be impossible. This suggests that the Pokemon world's understanding of what constitutes life is broader than the version familiar to the surface world, that there are forms of self-sustaining, self-replicating organization that operate on the chemistry of extreme heat rather than the chemistry of moderate warmth and liquid water. Regirock, Regis, and Registeel present a different kind of geological mystery. They are ancient golems created by an intelligence whose identity is uncertain, sealed into specific regions, and held in a state of waiting. The puzzles required to awaken them, complex patterns of movement and position, suggest that whoever created them wanted to ensure that only certain kinds of minds could access them. They were not created to be perpetually available. They were created to be hidden, to wait, to respond only to those who had learned something specific enough to earn the encounter. The deeper mystery of the Regis is Regigigas, the enormous golem described as the one that towed the continents into their current positions using rope. This claim, buried in Pokédex entries and mythology, positions Regigigas as a participant in the physical arrangement of the world, not just an observer or a combatant, but a laborer, something that moved the literal land masses of the planet through physical effort. The scale of this, if taken seriously, is extraordinary. Continents weigh quadrillions of tons. The rope that could hold them would have to be unlike anything in ordinary experience. And yet, the mythology frames this not as an impossible thing, but as a thing that was simply done, long ago, by a being large and strong enough to do it. Volcanion exists at the intersection of fire and water, two elements that conventional thinking places in fundamental opposition. Its body contains chambers of highly pressurized water that are heated by internal fire until they explode outward as a combination of steam and superheated liquid. The force of these expulsions is described as powerful enough to carve through mountains, not over geological time, but in a single event. Volcanion was found in very specific, mountainous, steam-filled environments, places where the geological and biological have merged into something that is neither purely one nor the other. The mythology of Groudon, which carries the distinction of being the heaviest Pokémon documented, speaks to the elemental quality of land itself as a living force. Groudon does not merely live on the land. It is the land, in some essential sense, a being whose megadrought-inducing presence transforms the environment around it in the same way a volcanic eruption transforms the surrounding landscape, not because it is trying to, but because of what it simply is. Its super ancient form, Primal Groudon, strips away even the thin membrane between creature and element, revealing something that is more geological event than animal. The forests and wilder places of the Pokemon world are home to mysteries of a quieter kind. These are the mysteries of old growth and deep shade, of creatures whose lives intersect with the slow processes of ecology and time in ways that mirror and illuminate each other. Celebi is already known as a time traveler, but the lore around it is specifically tied to forests, not to any location, but to healthy, thriving old growth. Wherever Celebi has been, the forest grows more richly. This is not presented as a magical enhancement. It is described more like an ecological effect, as if Celebi's presence, perhaps across many visits across many time periods, deposits something that accumulates like nutrients in soil. A forest that has seen Celebi across centuries would grow into something remarkable, not because of a single intervention, but because of the compounding of many small ones. The lore never specifies what exactly Celebi deposits or activates. It simply notes the result, flourishing life where it has passed. Zarud lives deep within forests and is deeply suspicious of outsiders, protective of its territory and its clan, with a possessiveness that borders on aggression. But there is a gentleness in the specific lore that surrounds it. The story of a Zarud that raised an injured child found in the forest, providing healing from the vines of its body against every instinct that told it to drive the stranger away. This is not a story about a creature without rules. It is a story about a creature whose capacity for compassion exceeded its rules in a specific moment. The mystery in Zarud is not in its power or its origin, but in the question of what it means that a creature so territorial could also contain this. The forest is not only a place of rules, it is also a place of exceptions. Sudowoodo has concealed its nature from casual observation for so long that it has become a mystery in the most ordinary sense. It mimics a tree so thoroughly that untrained observers walk past it without question. Its body is shaped like a branch, its coloring matches the season. But it is not a plant. It is a rock-type Pokémon wearing the form of something it is not. Why? The entries suggest that it fears water, which damages it severely, and that its tree-like appearance helps it avoid being near rivers or standing in the rain. The disguise is not vanity but survival strategy, a creature that has evolved into the shape of its environment's least suspicious object. Phantom is described as the spirit of a child who died in the forest and was reborn in an old tree stump. Its voice carries the sound of a child calling out, which travelers in deep forest may hear without recognizing the source. The mystery of Phantom is not in its danger, which is minimal, but in what it implies about the nature of its experience. Is the child's consciousness present within the stump? Does it understand what has happened? The entries describe Phantom wandering in search of other living things, drawn to warmth and movement, which sounds less like haunting and more like loneliness of a very specific kind. The loneliness of someone who has been transformed into something strange and is still looking for connection in a world that no longer recognizes them. Trevenant, its evolution, is a guardian of forests in the most absolute sense. It can control other trees with its roots, using them to trap and hold anything it perceives as a threat to its forest. The trapping is complete. Things trapped by Trevenant do not escape, but the entries note that Trevenant allows those it considers harmless to pass through freely. Even shelters small creatures in its body during harsh weather. It is a being of both absolute severity and genuine warmth, depending entirely on what you represent. The forest in the world of Pokémon is not simply a place to pass through. It is a domain with its own jurisdiction. The sky and the space beyond it hold mysteries that the Pokémon world approaches with a particular kind of awe. These are not earthly mysteries. They are the kind that require looking upward and accepting that some questions are only visible from very far away. Rayquaza has lived in the ozone layer of the planet for hundreds of millions of years, feeding on particles and meteorites as they enter the atmosphere. It is described as essentially never descending to the surface, its entire existence taking place in that thin layer of atmosphere high above the clouds where the air is too thin to breathe and the temperature plunges to extremes that most life cannot survive. Rayquaza knows the sky the way deep ocean creatures know the dark, as a permanent home rather than a place to visit. The mythology surrounding Rayquaza positions it as the arbiter of the ancient conflict between Kyogre and Groudon, the being whose arrival ended the clash that would have reshaped the world. But the entries also note that Rayquaza has no permanent home on the surface, that it descends only when needed, and then ascends again into the upper atmosphere. The image this creates is of a being that watches from very high above, aware of what is happening on the surface, capable of intervention, but choosing most of the time to remain in its own domain. There is a patience in this that feels like something other than indifference, something more like the patience of someone who knows they will be needed eventually and has decided to be ready. Deoxys arrived from space, its body formed around a virus that existed in the outer atmosphere of another world and was struck by a laser beam that caused it to mutate into a Pokémon. This origin is among the strangest in the entire Pokédex. A virus, struck by energy, becoming conscious and mobile, and capable of changing its own physical form at will. The forms deoxys can shift between, attack, defense, speed, and a normal baseline, represent not different species, but different configurations of the same entity, a being flexible enough in its fundamental structure to reorganize itself depending on what a situation demands. This level of biological plasticity has no equivalent in the natural world. It suggests a form of life built on entirely different principles than those governing carbon-based organisms. Rayquaza is not the only sky-dwelling creature with deep time behind it. Lugia is described as the guardian of the seas, and yet spends most of its time not at the ocean's surface, but deep underwater, in a trench it has made its home for an indeterminate period of time. The reason given is that Lugia's power is so immense that its wings, when spread, create storms powerful enough to destroy the coastlines below. It stays deep not out of hibernation, but out of something resembling responsibility, a self-imposed restraint born from awareness of what it can do. A creature so powerful that living among other things requires it to stay far away. The three legendary birds of the Kanto region, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, are each connected to a specific natural phenomenon in ways that go beyond typing. Articuno can control ice and snow, but the deeper mystery in its entries is its relationship to travelers in distress. When someone is lost in the mountains, freezing, without hope of rescue, Articuno sometimes appears before them. What happens next varies. Some say it leads people to safety. Others say that its appearance is a final vision before the cold takes everything. Whether Articuno saves or simply witnesses is one of the questions the entries allow both possibilities for without resolution, which is perhaps the most honest thing to do with a mystery of that particular kind. Zapdos emerges from thunderclouds during storms, its feathers crackling with electricity so intense that rain turns to steam around it. Its entries describe it as growing stronger every time it is struck by lightning, which places it in a category of being that is energized rather than damaged by the forces that would destroy most other creatures. Moltres, migrating annually with the seasons, leaves behind traces of warmth that are said to signal the arrival of spring to mountain communities. Its movement is slow enough to be tracked by experienced observers, and its passage is considered an omen, not of danger, but of change, of the world turning its face toward warmth again after winter. The ice regions of the Pokémon world contain mysteries of stillness and depth. Cold is not merely the absence of heat, it is a condition that preserves, that slows, that allows the ancient to remain present in ways that warmth dissolves. The creatures of the cold carry this quality within them. Regis was formed from ice that has been in glacial stasis for at least 10,000 years. According to the Pokédex entries that describe its origin, the ice of its body is colder than any naturally occurring cold, deeper than the coldest recorded atmospheric temperature, cold in a way that begins to seem like something other than temperature, like a quality the ice has developed rather than merely a measure of how much heat is absent. Regis does not melt. Its temperature does not change in response to its environment. It maintains its own cold through something internal, some mechanism the entries do not explain. It simply is cold, absolutely and permanently. Cryogonal appears in snowstorms, and is itself made of ice crystals arranged in a flat hexagonal form. It floats above the snow, its chains of ice crystals trailing below it like something waiting to catch. The entries explain that it forms during winter in snow clouds, that each one has a unique arrangement of crystals, and that when the temperature rises in spring, it melts completely, its consciousness apparently dissipating along with its body. But in winter, it forms again, from new snow, and the question of whether this new formation is the same individual or a different one with no connection to what dissolved is not answered. Does consciousness resume from where it left off? Is there continuity across the dissolution? Or is each winter's cryogonal a fresh beginning, with no memory of the cold that came before? Berdic lives in Arctic conditions and swims through frozen seas by creating footholds of ice with its frozen breath. Its entries note that its breath is cold enough to instantly freeze seawater, creating solid platforms in liquid ocean as it moves. The mechanics of this, The sheer thermal energy required to freeze salt water at a rate sufficient to support the weight of a large polar bear as it moves are not addressed in the Pokédex, but the image of Beartic moving across an open Arctic sea, each breath ahead of it becoming ice, each step landing on something that moments before was liquid, carries a kind of beauty that belongs specifically to cold places. Avalug's body is flat and broad, designed to carry smaller Pokemon across glaciers, its surface so stable that others travel on it as they would a platform. The entries describe this relationship matter-of-factly, as though it is simply one of the ecological roles that exist in cold regions. But there is something worth sitting with in the image, a living glacier that other creatures trust enough to stand on, a body so slow and so massive that it has become part of the landscape for those who live alongside it. Avalug is not passive in this. It does not simply allow the riding. The entries suggest it moves toward destinations in ways that benefit the Pokemon using it as transport. This is cooperation without language, a relationship built on trust between creatures whose inner lives we can only partially imagine. Psychic-type Pokemon raise questions that the Pokemon world never quite manages to fully contain within its own framework. The ability to read minds, to see the future, to move objects without contact, to project images into others' perceptions, these are abilities that, if real, would fundamentally change the nature of knowledge, privacy, and what it means to be a self among other selves. Alakazam's intelligence is described as surpassing that of a supercomputer, its brain generating so much electrical activity that its body constantly crackles with psychic energy. Its IQ is listed in some entries at 5,000, though what this number means in practical terms, what a mind of that capacity actually experiences from moment to moment, is something the entries do not attempt to describe. What would it feel like to remember every moment of your life from birth with perfect clarity? What would the world look like to a being capable of processing information at that speed? Would ordinary time feel impossibly slow? Would conversations with less cognitively endowed beings feel the way conversations feel to very patient adults talking with very young children? Espeon evolved its psychic abilities out of devotion to a trainer, its fine fur developing sensitivity to air currents and emotional states simultaneously. This dual sensitivity is interesting. The same evolutionary pressure that made it attuned to the physical world, the currents that carry information about nearby movement and change, also opened it to emotional information. Emotion and physics in Espeon's body are processed through the same sensory system. This suggests that in the Pokemon world's understanding, emotional information is not categorically different from physical information. Both are simply patterns in the environment, and a sufficiently sensitive organism can learn to read both. Metagross is described as having formed when two Metang combined, and each Metang formed when two Beldum combined, giving Metagross effectively four separate brains working simultaneously. The computation available to it, four independent neural systems sharing information across a linked network, is described as exceeding that of a supercomputer. Metagross pins its prey under its massive body and uses the suckers on its arms to feed, while its multiple brains process the strategic situation from different angles simultaneously. There is something almost computational about the way it hunts, running parallel analyses, updating probability estimates in real time. It is a creature whose entire evolutionary history has been oriented toward intelligence as the primary survival strategy. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf are described as coming into existence simultaneously with the formation of Lake Valor, Lake Acuity, and Lake Verity in the Sinnoh region, emerging from the same creative act that shaped the lakes themselves. They are the embodiments of knowledge, emotion, and willpower, respectively, which positions them as something stranger than psychic Pokemon in the ordinary sense. They are not beings that happen to develop psychic abilities. They are, according to the mythology, the sources of those qualities in all intelligent life. Uxie is described as having given knowledge to human, Mesprit as having taught humanity what it means to feel, Azelf as having given the will to act. Before these beings came into existence, according to the mythology, life did not possess these things. What this mythology implies about the Sinnoh region's understanding of consciousness is profound. It is not treating knowledge, emotion, and will as properties that evolved gradually through natural selection. It is treating them as gifts, external additions to biological existence, given at a specific moment by specific beings who chose to give them. This positions consciousness not as an emergent property of complex biology, but as something that was contributed to life from outside by beings that pre existed the capacity to receive them. Whether the mythology is literally true within the world, or whether it is a beautiful way of approaching something that could also be described in evolutionary terms, is left appropriately to the listener. The mysteries of the Pokemon world do not all reside in large legendary beings or ancient cosmological events. Some of the deepest questions emerge from the most ordinary interactions, from creatures that appear in the early roots of every game, whose Pokédex entries contain details that, examined slowly, reveal something extraordinary. Caterpie is a caterpillar. It emerges from its egg, it eats, it grows, it forms a chrysalis, and it emerges as Butterfree. This is so familiar as to seem unremarkable, but the process of metamorphosis, even in the real world, is genuinely strange enough that scientists are still working to understand its mechanism. What happens inside a chrysalis is not a slow transformation of one body into another. The caterpillar essentially digests most of itself, breaking down into a cellular soup, and from that soup the butterfly rebuilds itself according to an entirely different body plan. The caterpillar and the butterfly are not in continuous physical relationship the way a child and an adult are. The caterpillar dissolves, and from what it was, something completely different assembles itself. The Pokédex entries do not address this process in depth, but the evolution system in the games captures something of its strangeness. The caterpillar does not gradually develop wings. It enters the cocoon stage and emerges as a fundamentally different being. Whatever Caterpie knew, whatever it experienced, is carried forward into Butterfree in some form, because Butterfree can remember its trainer and respond to commands. There is a continuity of relationship, even across the dissolution and reconstruction of the body. What form that continuity takes, how memory and identity cross the boundary of metamorphosis, is a question that the games make visible without answering. Magnemite is a steel and electric type that appears to be primarily composed of magnets and a metallic sphere, with no apparent biological material. Yet it is a living creature, capable of independent movement, of learning, of forming bonds with trainers, of evolving. Its entries explain that it floats by using magnetic fields to counteract gravity, that its electrical charge builds naturally and must be periodically discharged. The mystery of Magnemite is not dramatic. It is quiet and pervasive. How is it alive? What defines life in the Pokemon world such that a metallic sphere with magnets attached qualifies as a living being? The entries do not answer this, because the question, taken seriously, opens into territories that even the game's comprehensive mythology has not fully mapped. Voltorb and Electrode have been mistaken for Pokeballs for so long that their entries note researchers are unsure whether the Pokeball shape came first, or whether these Pokemon existed before Pokeballs and the balls were designed to resemble them. This is a mystery of uncertain origin that runs in both directions. It may be that exposure to Pokeballs shaped the evolution of these creatures toward a resemblance. It may be that the creatures already existed in this form, and the technology was built around something that already lived. The chicken and egg quality of this question is acknowledged in the lore and left unresolved, which is the appropriate response to a question that may genuinely not have an accessible answer. The relationship between legendary Pokemon and the regions they inhabit is one of the subtler mysteries, the way these beings shape not just the mythology of a place, but its ecology, its weather, its sense of what is possible. Each region seems to carry the quality of its legendary beings and the texture of its landscape. The Johto region's Ho-Oh carries the mystery of the three original beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, within it. These three were ordinary Pokemon, according to the lore, who were present in the Brass Tower when it burned, caught in a fire that should have been fatal. Ho-Oh descended from its flight and resurrected them, transforming them in the process into something that embodied the elements of their death and rebirth. Raikou, struck by lightning that started the blaze, became lightning itself. Entei, surrounded by fire, became the walking embodiment of volcanic heat. Suicune, revived by the rain that fell to end the fire, became the purifier of water. What is quietly extraordinary about this mythology is the relationship between the manner of death and the nature of resurrection. Ho-Oh did not simply return these three to what they had been, it transformed them according to what had happened to them, as if death and the specific conditions of death had become part of their identity, something to be incorporated rather than erased. The trauma became the nature. This is a profound thing for a mythology to suggest, the idea that what nearly destroys you can become, if something powerful and compassionate intervenes, the source of what you become. Lucia is the guardian of the seas and the master of the three legendary birds. When the balance between Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres is disturbed, the effects are felt across the entire ocean, storms spreading from where they dwell. The three birds fight among themselves when the balance is lost, and the world's weather becomes chaotic as a result. Lugia's role is not simply to exist, but to maintain, to be the presence that keeps three powerful and competitive forces from consuming each other and taking the natural world with them. Its isolation at the bottom of the ocean is not purely self-protection. It is also, in a sense, the rest that a guardian takes between moments of service. The lake guardians of Sinnoh are described as having willingly given the abilities of knowledge, emotion, and will to the world, and then retreating into the lakes as if the giving exhausted them. This image, three beings that gave the essential qualities of consciousness to all living things, and then went to rest in the quiet depths of three separate mountain lakes, carries something in it that functions like gratitude and something else that functions like recognition. The world they helped create, the world full of feeling and knowing and willing, continues above them. They rest below, present without demanding acknowledgement, available without asserting themselves. The mystery of their nature is also the mystery of generosity itself. There is a dimension of the Pokémon world that does not appear on any map, does not correspond to any known region, and yet is present in the lore as a place that exists simultaneously with and alongside everything familiar. The distortion world where Giratina was exiled is the clearest expression of this dimension, a place where the rules governing the ordinary world, the directions of up and down, the way objects behave in relation to gravity and perspective, do not apply. Giratina was banished there for its violent nature, according to the mythology, and became the ruler of a world that could not be mapped by conventional means. Its altered form, when it appears briefly in the ordinary world, suggests power contained and compressed into something that can exist within normal physical space. Its origin form, seen in its own domain, is longer and more unconstrained, a body that reflects the freedom of a place where nothing needs to hold a fixed shape. The distortion world is both Giratina's prison and its kingdom, a contradiction that the mythology allows to stand without resolution. What the distortion world implies about the structure of the Pokémon universe is significant. It suggests that the ordinary world, the one with maps and routes and cities, and the familiar physics of solid ground and directed gravity, is only one layer of something with more depth than its surface suggests. The distortion world is not simply a different location. It is a different mode of existence, accessible from certain points in the ordinary world, but operating by different rules entirely. This is not unusual in mythology. The idea of an underworld or a mirror realm or a world beneath the world is ancient. But the way the Pokémon mythology treats it, as a place with its own sovereign, its own ecology, its own physical laws, gives it a specificity that most mythological underworlds lack. The ultra wormholes introduced in the Alola region expand this further, opening pathways to ultraspace, a dimension beyond ordinary dimensions from which ultra beasts arrive. The ultra beasts are not Pokemon in the conventional sense, or rather, they are beings that evolved under conditions so different from those of the Pokemon world that they present as deeply alien, following behaviors and having physiologies that make little sense In the context of the familiar, Nihilego is parasitic and ghost-like of O1 symbiont, attaching itself to host organisms in ways that blur the boundary between the parasite and the host. Buzzwole is muscle and force taken to an almost satirical extreme, a being that seems to consist of nothing but compressed power and the means to deploy it. These are not mysteries in the narrative sense, they are mysteries in the taxonomic sense. The Pokemon world is encountering life forms that it cannot yet classify, beings that share enough with Pokemon to interact with the world's systems, but are different enough that the existing categories do not quite contain them. Necrozma, which absorbs light to sustain itself and originated from a realm called the Ultra Megapolis, where all light had been consumed, presents perhaps the most poignant mystery in this dimension. It arrived in the world like a body arrives in an emergency, depleted and desperate, absorbing the light it needed to survive, and in doing so dimming everything around it. Its original form, before it lost the light that was taken from it, is described as a being of pure radiant light. What was taken from Necrozma was not just power, but the essential quality of what it was. The desperate consuming being the world encounters is not the creature it was meant to be. It is what remains when something loses what defined it, and must find a way to continue regardless. The passage of evolutionary change in the Pokemon world raises mysteries of biological and philosophical depth. Evolution in the games happens in moments, a creature becoming something new and larger and different between one state and the next. But the underlying questions of what evolution means, what is retained, and what is lost in transformation are present in the lore and in the behavior of the creatures themselves. The relationship between Magikarp and Gyarados is perhaps the most dramatic single evolutionary transformation in the entire Pokédex. Magikarp is described as the weakest of all Pokemon, capable of barely splashing when removed from water, useful for almost nothing, surviving only because it can live in the most polluted and degraded water conditions imaginable. Its entries note that it has persisted throughout history precisely because of how little it requires to survive. It is a record of endurance without capability, existence maintained by the absolute minimum. Gyarados is among the most powerful and feared creatures in the world, a massive serpentine being whose rampages are described as lasting up to a month and devastating entire cities. The entries note that when it changes from Magikarp to Gyarados, its brain cells undergo a complete rearrangement, and this rearrangement is associated with the ferocity and destructive rage that Gyarados exhibits. Something in the process of becoming that powerful creates an anger that takes a very long time to subside. The mystery here is not in the power, it is in the continuity. What is the relationship between the Magikarp that spent months splashing uselessly in a muddy pond and the Gyarados that emerges and destroys a coastline? Do they share memories? Does the Gyarados remember being small and helpless? Is any of that fury a response to what it once was? The entries do not say, but the transformation is too dramatic to be comfortable with the idea that nothing of the earlier self survived. Something crossed the threshold. What it makes of having crossed it is the unanswered question. Slowpoke's evolution is famous for depending on a Shelder biting its tail or its head, which transforms it into Slowbro or Slowking respectively. The evolutionary pressure here is external, requiring the intervention of another species to complete the transformation. This makes Slowpoke's evolution one of the most explicitly ecological in the Pokédex, a reminder that evolution is not always an individual process, but sometimes a relationship between species. The Shelder that attaches itself to Slowpoke is also changed by the interaction, transforming from its original form into a specialized spiral shell that interfaces with Slowpoke's nervous system. Both creatures are altered. The relationship changes them in ways that neither could experience alone. What makes Slowking particularly interesting is that the Shelder venom, which causes the transformation, reaches Slowking's brain rather than stopping at its tail as with Slowbro. The entries describe this venom as actually enhancing Slowking's intelligence rather than degrading it, giving it knowledge and insight that it could not have developed without that specific intervention. Slowking is considered one of the wisest Pokémon, sought out for guidance in some traditions. Its wisdom was given to it by a bite. by a relationship of apparent predation that became instead a relationship of mutual transformation. This is not a metaphor the entries are trying to make. It is simply the biology of the creature. But the resonance is there, available to anyone who sits with it for a moment. The question of what Arceus is, and what it means that the Pokemon world has a creator deity, is one that the games have consistently allowed to remain enormous rather than trying to make small enough to fully answer. Arceus is described as the being that shaped the universe from nothing, creating the world and all the dimensions connected to it with its 1,000 arms, emerging from a single egg in the void before anything else existed. The Hall of Origin, a location in the 4th generation games that was associated with Arceus in promotional materials, and through an item that was never officially distributed widely, was designed as a place literally above everything, accessible from the top of Spear Pillar, already the location where Dialga and Palkia could be encountered. Its placement architecturally above the location where time and space are governed suggests that Arceus exists at a level prior to both, prior to the framework that time and space constitute. You cannot travel to Arceus through ordinary space, because Arceus precedes the existence of ordinary space. The 180 types, represented by the 180 plates associated with Arceus, suggest that all the elemental properties of the world, fire and water and grass and all the rest, exist as modalities of a single underlying principle. Arceus holds them all. It can embody any of them. This is not the same as having no type. It is the same as having all types simultaneously, held in a unity that can be projected into any single one when needed. The plates that restrict Arceus to a single type when held are, in this reading, not limitations but lenses, ways of focusing what is otherwise too large to look at directly. What the mythology of Arceus implies for the daily lives of ordinary Pokemon and people in the world is not addressed in the games. The existence of a creator deity does not seem to generate formal religious practice in the same way it does in many real-world traditions. The mythology is present, told in inscriptions and old books and the oral traditions of specific regions. But the games never suggest that people in the Pokemon world organize their lives around the fact of Arceus in the way that knowledge of a creator shapes societies in the real world. This absence is itself a kind of mystery, a silence worth noting. The dark and ghost dual typing of Spiritome carries within it a history that the games frame explicitly as moral. Spiritome is composed of 108 souls sealed into a cornerstone by a traveling Pokemon merchant after it committed too many terrible acts. 108 is a significant number in Buddhist tradition, corresponding to the 108 earthly temptations or defilements. Whether this connection is intentional within the Pokemon mythology, or whether it is a numerical coincidence absorbed from cultural context, the result is a creature whose very body is an accumulation of wrongdoing, a collection of harmful things that could not be allowed to continue separately and were bound together so that the container would be easier to manage than the contents. What the 108 souls experience inside Spiritome, whether they are conscious of their situation, whether they cooperate or conflict, whether the hundreds of years of binding have produced something like a shared identity, or whether they remain separate within the aggregate, is information the entries do not provide. Spiritome is described as having a malicious nature and no known weaknesses, neither of which helps identify what it is like to be inside it. It is sealed and present simultaneously, contained and active, one of the more philosophically dense objects in the entire Pokédex. Darkrai causes nightmares to those who sleep in its presence, not out of malice, but apparently as an uncontrollable side effect of existing near sleeping beings. Its entries note that it does not approach humans willingly and lives on a small, dark island away from populated areas precisely to avoid causing harm. The nightmare is not a weapon. It is something the creature produces the way certain flowers produce a scent that is pleasant to some and overwhelming to others. Darkrai cannot turn it off. It can only remove itself. There is a version of Darkrai's story, told in the mythology associated with it, in which it spent time trying to help a person who was trapped in a permanent nightmare, traveling into the dream to fight something that did not belong there. the story does end tidily, but it establishes that Darkrai's relationship to nightmares is not simple. It can navigate them, it understands their logic. Whether this is because it creates them and knows their architecture from the inside, or whether it has spent so much of its existence surrounded by them that it has learned their patterns, the lore does not clarify. Both possibilities are consistent with everything else known about it. Hoopa, in its confined form, appears as a small, impish creature capable of summoning enormous objects through the rings it carries diamonds, buildings, oceans worth of water. It does this apparently for amusement, passing things through its rings with the casual disinterest of someone who has never had to think about the weight of what they are. Its unbound form is something entirely different, a massive entity described as greedy and immensely powerful, possessing enough strength to bend the dimensions themselves. The bottle that confines the unbound form is the same mythology as Spiritome's cornerstone in a different register, a powerful being sealed inside a container, accessible but contained, dangerous if released, present but not quite free. The final dimension of the Pokemon world's mysteries is perhaps the one most consistently overlooked in favor of more dramatic questions. It is the mystery of what ordinary life in this world is like, how ordinary Pokemon experience existence in environments that, examined closely, are full of strangeness and wonder that never quite gets labeled as mysterious because it is too quotidian, too present in every route and cave and building to be noticed clearly. Slowpoke fishes with its tail for hours, if not days, at a time. It does not appear to experience urgency. Its entries note that it is so slow in all its processes, including pain signals, that it barely notices when a shelter bites its tail. This is not described as a disability, but simply as a characteristic, a way of being in the world where the gap between event and awareness is long enough that most urgency simply resolves before it is fully registered. Living at the speed of Slowpoke would mean inhabiting a world where most things that feel pressing to faster creatures do not arrive at consciousness quickly enough to create the sensation of pressure. Whether this constitutes a peaceful existence is something the entries leave open. Snorlax sleeps for most of its life, waking only to eat and then returning to sleep once it has consumed enough to satisfy its enormous metabolic needs. The entries describe its capacity in terms so large they become almost abstract, multiple tons of food before sleep is possible again. But they also note that its stomach lining is so tough that it can digest almost anything without difficulty, that it eats whatever is available without discrimination, that it does not appear to experience dissatisfaction in the way that selective eaters do. Snorlax's relationship to the world is framed entirely around sleep and sustenance, two of the most fundamental biological drives reduced to their purest expression in a single, enormous creature. The Pokemon Munchlax, Snorlax's pre-evolution, is perpetually hungry rather than perpetually sleepy, spending all of its time searching for food rather than resting. The shift from Munchlax to Snorlax is essentially a shift from one consuming drive to another, from the restlessness of hunger to the stillness of satiation. What the evolution represents, if anything beyond simple biology, is a creature that spends its youth in constant wanting, and its adulthood in a heavy, almost philosophical stillness, resting in the aftermath of having finally had enough. Jigglypuff's song puts listeners to sleep, and the entries note that Jigglypuff becomes furious when it discovers its audience sleeping, drawing on their faces with a marker it always carries. This small detail, the fury and the marker, is one of the Pokédex's most quietly human moments. A creature whose only truly remarkable ability is something it cannot perform without eliminating the audience for it. A being that sings to connect with others and finds instead that the connection it creates is unconsciousness rather than shared experience. The marker is not malicious. It is the exasperation of an artist whose art keeps winning against its own purpose. Clefairy gathers under the moon on nights when it is full, dancing in a circle of something that the entries describe as mystic energy. The dances are not explained. They serve no obviously biological purpose. They happen because something in Clefairy responds to the full moon with a compulsion toward gathering and movement that overrides other concerns. Whether this is communicative or reproductive, or simply an expression of something that the entries do not have a name for, is unclear. But the image of Clefairy dancing under a full moon in a mountain clearing, in a circle, in a tradition old enough that it happens without variation whenever conditions are right, contains a mystery that is not dependent on the creature being powerful or rare. It is the mystery of behavior that exceeds obvious explanation, of living things doing things because they have always done them, because something inside them insists on it. The Pokemon world's relationship with weather is one of the most revealing aspects of its deeper architecture. Weather in the ordinary sense is already remarkable, a product of atmospheric systems so complex that even with all the computational power available to modern science, accurate prediction beyond a few days remains genuinely difficult. In the Pokemon world, weather is also biological, a byproduct of the presence and activity of specific creatures, which changes its nature entirely. Cast form is perhaps the most directly expressive of this relationship. Its physical form changes depending on the weather around it, not as an adaptation over evolutionary time, but in real time, within moments. Sun transforms it into a warm orange sphere. Rain transforms it into a dark, heavy droplet form. Hail reshapes it into something cold and crystalline. The transformation is not cosmetic. The entries suggest that cast form genuinely becomes a different kind of being in different weather conditions, that its cells reorganize in response to atmospheric input in a way that no other documented creature replicates. It is a creature whose identity is contextual, whose body is a living barometer that does not merely measure the sky, but becomes it. Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus bring a different relationship to weather. These three roam the Unova region, and their passage is described as catastrophically dangerous in ways that seem disproportionate to any animal's normal movement through an environment. Tornadus produces winds of such intensity that it can demolish houses and uproot trees simply by flying over them at speed. Thundurus scatters lightning as it moves, igniting fires that spread through dry vegetation without any intent behind them. Their movement through populated areas is described in a register of natural disaster rather than ordinary animal behavior, which raises the question of whether these beings understand what their passage does, and if so, whether they can modulate it. Landorus, the third of these beings, is positioned in the mythology as a force of agricultural abundance, its arrival in an area associated with rich harvests and good crops. The relationship between the three is presented as a kind of ecological balance, the destructive energy of the other two kept from total devastation by the regenerative presence of the third. This triangular dynamic, where two forces of disruption are counterbalanced by a third force of restoration, appears in other parts of the Pokemon mythology as well. It is a structure the world returns to repeatedly, as though its authors understood intuitively that unchecked power requires something capable of cycling its effects back into something livable. Pelipper carries weather in a different and more intimate way. The entries note that it scoops up water in its large bill as it flies over the ocean and carries that water for long distances before releasing it. This behavior, if widespread enough, would contribute meaningfully to rain distribution across a region, effectively making Pelipper a participant in the hydrological cycle. A flock of Pelipper moving inland from the ocean carries within each bird a small reservoir of ocean water, which will eventually fall somewhere far from the sea as something resembling rain. The creature does not understand this about itself. It is simply doing what it does, but the effect at scale is substantial. The relationship between Pokemon and human tools, artifacts, and discarded objects is one of the quieter areas of Pokemon mystery, but the questions it raises are some of the most philosophically interesting. Several Pokemon come into being specifically through the interaction of spiritual energy or unusual circumstances with ordinary manufactured objects, raising questions about where the line between the living and the non-living actually runs in this world. Klinklang and its Prevolutions are mechanical Pokemon composed of interlocking gears. They are not biological in any traditional sense. They have no organic tissue, no cells, no metabolic processes based on chemical reactions between carbon based molecules. Yet they are living beings capable of learning, of forming relationships with trainers, of gaining strength through experience. The gears rotate because something animates them, some principle that the Pokédex entries do not explain. They simply are alive, and the means by which the non living becomes living in the Pokemon world is one of the fundamental mysteries the world carries without providing a mechanism for. Rotom inhabits electrical appliances, transforming its nature depending on what it has taken up residence in. In a refrigerator, it becomes cold type. In a lawnmower, it becomes grass type. In a washing machine, it becomes water type. This is a being whose elemental nature is not fixed, but responsive, shaped by the object it chooses to inhabit the way a voice is shaped by the space it speaks in. What Rotom is when it inhabits nothing, its base plasma form, is already strange enough, a creature composed of electrical plasma that can move through wiring and circuitry the way other creatures move through air. But the appliance forms raise an additional question. What does a refrigerator experience when it becomes a living being? What does it mean to be a washing machine that thinks? Litwick and its evolutions, Lampent and Chandelure, take the question of what it means to inhabit a manufactured object in a darker direction. Litwick appears to be a candle, small and innocuous, flickering with a warm light that seems comforting. But the entries explain that this light is actually the souls of beings that Litwick has consumed, their energy burning as its flame. The warmth it gives off is borrowed from lives it has diminished. When you see a Litwick burning cheerfully in a dark room, the light it provides comes from the vitality it has drained from something that was more fully alive before the encounter. Haunter and its line exist in a space between being and nothing that the entries describe in terms more phenomenological than biological. Haunter is composed of gas, able to pass through solid material, able to shrink to a point at which it is effectively invisible. Its tongue, according to the entries, causes an uncontrollable shiver that does not stop if it licks a person, and this shiver slowly drains away the warmth of life until something like hypothermia claims the victim. This is a being that does harm by touching, by the most intimate form of contact, yet it does not have a body that can be touched in return. It can act on the world, but cannot be acted on in the same way. This asymmetry, this ability to make contact that cannot be reciprocated, is part of what makes ghost-type Pokemon feel genuinely uncanny rather than simply spooky. The question of Pokemon cognition and whether or to what degree Pokemon understand their own situation is one that the games consistently approach with the kind of care that comes from not wanting to close a question prematurely. The evidence available is suggestive and contradictory in interesting ways. Alakazam, as already noted, possesses IQ that the entries place in extraordinary territory, but Alakazam is an outlier. Most Pokemon are described in their entries without reference to high intelligence, and the question of what cognition is actually present is approached differently for different species. Pokemon clearly learn, they respond to commands, they seem to form preferences and attachments, they exhibit behaviors that, in the real world, would be considered evidence of at least rudimentary consciousness. But the entries are not consistent about what this means. Slowpoke is described as having a brain that is so slow its thoughts sometimes take 5 seconds to register. This is presented as a characteristic rather than a deficit. 5 seconds is a long time in the context of consciousness. A conversation conducted with the normal human gap of a fraction of a second between thought and response would, from Slowpoke's perspective, feel like being shouted at. The world would arrive before the self was ready for it, yet Slowpoke manages to live, to eat, to occasionally evolve into something wise. Whatever is happening in that slow mind is sufficient for an existence that, from the outside, appears perfectly sustainable. Oranguru sits quietly in treetops, meditating, occasionally producing a fan made from materials it has gathered. The entries describe it as treating injured Pokemon with natural medicines and acting as a counselor of sorts to other Pokemon in its forest. This is a remarkable description. Not a creature that fights, that hunts, that defends territory in the ordinary biological way, but one that tends, that advises, that uses gathered materials to aid others. Whether this constitutes wisdom in any sense beyond the behavioral is something the entries do not venture to say, but the behavior itself, the gathering of materials, the treating of wounds, the apparent advising of others, is complex enough to be worth noting as one of the more remarkable things a Pokemon in the wild is documented doing. Vespiken's relationship to the combi that make up her hive is documented as thoroughly organized and specifically hierarchical. She directs the hive, controls reproduction, and the honey the hive produces is processed through her own body before being distributed. The hive functions as a superorganism in ways that parallel the real-world biology of social insects, but Vespiken's entries note that she will sacrifice individual combi without hesitation to defend the hive, which frames her decision-making in terms of a utilitarian calculus that operates across the collective. She is making trade-offs. Whatever cognitive process underlies those trade-offs, it is sophisticated enough to weigh individual loss against collective survival and produce consistent decisions. Whether it is experienced, whether there is something it is like to make those decisions, is the question the entries do not reach. Zoroark's ability to cast perfect illusions capable of deceiving multiple observers simultaneously raises questions about the relationship between perception and reality that are not purely biological. An illusion that fools the senses of a large group of people is functionally an alternate reality for those people. Their experience of their environment is real. The decisions they make based on that experience are real decisions with real consequences. The fact that the substrate of their experience is false does not make the experience false. What Zoroark can do is effectively rewrite the experienced world for anyone in its range, which is a power that operates not on bodies, but on the relationship between minds and what they take to be real. The Alola region's specific ecology created conditions for the development of several particularly mysterious forms, creatures shaped by islands, by exposure to unusual energies, and by relationships with the human communities that settled on those islands over many generations. The regional variants that appear in Alola are not simply color changes. They represent genuine evolutionary divergence, bodies reshaped by different environments in ways that change not just appearance, but elemental nature. Alolan Marowak, the ghost and fire type variant of a Pokémon that in Kanto is simply a ground type, is perhaps the most emotionally resonant of these. The mythology around this form suggests that the Marowak who died protecting their children in this region were transformed after death into beings of flame, their maternal grief and protective fury becoming the fire they carry, the same bone they once used as a weapon now serving as a torch lit from within. The change from ground to fire and ghost is not explained in purely evolutionary terms. It is framed as something closer to spiritual transformation, the body changed by the quality and the intensity of what the creature experienced before it died. Alolan Raichu developed psychic abilities its Kanto counterpart lacks, apparently through long exposure to the sweet foods and calmer pace of the island lifestyle. This is one of the Pokéex's most charming connections between environment and biology, the idea that what a creature eats and how relaxed its daily existence is can over generations open up capacities that were not previously expressed. Alolan Raichu surfs on its psychically charged tail, drifting above the ground with an ease that reflects the unhurried quality of the environment that shaped it. It is a creature whose nature was softened and expanded by the gentleness of where it ended up. The Tapis are the guardian deities of the four main Alola Islands, beings whose presence and activity are woven into the ecology of their respective islands in ways that go beyond simple protection. Tapu Koko, the deity of Melamel Island, is described as moody and prone to sudden attack, but also as the first to rush to the aid of people in distress. The contradictions here, the volatility, and the compassion existing in the same being, is a quality that feels genuinely alive in the way that character inconsistencies in real beings feel alive, unexpected, contextually dependent, hard to reduce to a simple description. Tapu Lele, the deity of Akala Island, scatters scales with healing properties as it drifts through its territory, but also scatters scales that cause pain without any apparent awareness of or concern for which effect it is producing. It does what it does, and the effects, healing and harm, are distributed according to no principle visible from the outside. This combination of extraordinary generosity and total indifference is not presented as a paradox, but as a natural quality of a being whose awareness operates at a scale and in a mode that makes individual outcomes beneath the threshold of its attention. Tapu Bulu is rare in its appearances, deeply reluctant to use violence, preferring to signal its presence through sound and allow opponents to flee rather than engaging them. Its entries describe it as having brought a dead plant forest back to abundant life, its power expressed through growth rather than through force. The mystery of Tapu Bulu is in its restraint, a being of enormous power that chooses most of the time not to use it, that would rather watch things grow than destroy anything. There is a specific kind of strength in this that the entries allow to be admired without needing to explain where it comes from. Tapu Fini is the deity of Ula Ula Island's waters, capable of producing a mist so thick and dense that those who enter it cannot find their way out and eventually forget who they are and what they were seeking. The entries note that the rare clear water Tapu Fini produces can purify anything, but that it will only create this water for those whose hearts it judges to be sincere. The mist that claims the impure or the careless, and the purifying water given only to the genuinely worthy, are two expressions of the same being, the same capacity for discernment, applied differently depending on what it encounters. There is a particular quality of mystery attached to how the Pokémon world handles the concept of infinity and the very large. Several creatures and mythological beings are described in terms so vast that they resist being imagined at ordinary scales, and yet are presented within the games as things that can be encountered, interacted with, carried in a Pokeball. Eternatus is described as having arrived from space 5 billion years ago and taking up residence in the planet, absorbing its energy over those billions of years. 5 billion years is, for reference, longer than the Earth itself has existed. Eternatus arrived before the planet it now inhabits had fully formed, waited inside it, across its entire geological history, and is still there. Its Dynamax and Eternamax forms expand to scales so enormous that they affect the entire region, producing the Darkest Day, an event described in the mythology of the Galar region as the closest the world has come to being consumed by energy it could not contain. Rayquaza has existed in the ozone layer for the same hundreds of millions of years described in the Hoenn mythology. The planet beneath it has changed completely in that time. Seas have shifted, continents have moved, the creatures on the surface have evolved from things so primitive they left only the faintest chemical traces in rock into the full diversity of Pokémon and humans and every other organism now living. Rayquaza has watched this from above, feeding on particles unchanged in its fundamental nature, enduring in a stratum of air that shields the world below from the radiation that would sterilize it. Zygarde embodies something even more unusual. It is not a single creature, but a distributed system, individual cell-like units spread across the Kalos ecosystem that gather into more and more complete forms as more cells join. In its 10% form, it is small, dog-like, powerful but not extraordinary. In its 50% form, it is serpentine, enormous, capable of supervising and managing the ecosystem of an entire region. In its complete 100% form, it possesses so much power that its entries describe it as wielding enough force to devastate the world if pushed past the point of endurance. What Zygarde is monitoring, what it is watching for, what conditions would trigger it to consolidate its most complete form are questions the mythology leaves only partially answered. It is a creature whose full existence is most of the time distributed and invisible, present everywhere and apparently nowhere, a nervous system for an ecosystem that most inhabitants of that ecosystem never think about. Necrozma in its history, before the Ultra Megapolis stripped it of its light, was a being described as shining with the brilliance of a star, illuminating everything around it freely. The entries describe its original form as one of pure radiance, a being whose nature was light in the most complete sense of the word. What happened to it? The violence of having that light taken, the desperation of the consuming creature it became, is described with enough clarity that it functions almost as a tragedy. Not the tragedy of something powerful defeated in battle, but the tragedy of something fundamentally generous reduced to desperation. Necrozma, before its light was taken, was the opposite of the being you encounter. Understanding what Necrozma once was makes what it has become into something that cannot be addressed without acknowledging what it lost. The Pokemon world's handling of mythology and the uncertainty about which parts of mythology are literally true is one of its most sophisticated ongoing choices. Many of the creatures described in the regional mythologies are real and catchable within the games, but the mythologies are held in a register of uncertainty rather than certainty even after the creature has been encountered. The Sinnoh creation myth, written on stone tablets in the ruins at the top of Mount Coronet, describes events so ancient that no living being witnessed them. Arceus shaping the world, Dialga and Palkia emerging to govern time and space, Giratina being banished. These are presented as religious texts within the world, believed by some and questioned by others, exactly as real-world mythology occupies that ambiguous space between history and faith. The fact that you can encounter Dialga and Palkia and even Giratina does not resolve the uncertainty about what the creation myth describes. Meeting a being is not the same as verifying a cosmology. Dialga clearly exists. Whether Dialga literally created time by beginning to move is a different question, one that even the characters in the games who have encountered Dialga cannot answer definitively. The Kalos region's mythology concerning AZ and his machine, the machine that ended a great ancient war by annihilating everything on both sides, and that also, as a byproduct, resurrected one beloved Pokemon at the cost of countless other lives, is presented as historical rather than mythological, a thing that happened within recent enough memory that the consequences are still present in the world. AZ himself still walks the world, cursed with immortality by the power of the machine he built, seeking the Floette he resurrected, and then lost. This is a mystery in the most human sense, not a question about cosmology or elemental powers, but a question about what is owed and whether it can ever be fully paid. AZ gave more than he could afford to give to get back one creature he loved, and the cost of that transaction has been a life too long to bear. The myths of the Galar region concern the darkest day, and the two heroes who used the ancient sword and shield to end the crisis Eternatus created. What is mysterious about the Galar mythology is not the events it describes, but the relationship between the mythology and the actual history. The heroes are described as calling upon Zacian and Zamazenta, the cover legendary Pokemon of the 8th generation games, but the mythology is layered in a way that suggests the heroes may themselves have become the Pokemon they called upon, transformed by the encounter, their human forms exchanged for something that could persist across the centuries until the sword and shield were needed again. Whether this is literally what happened, or whether it is the mythological compression of a real event into a more memorable form is, within the games, genuinely uncertain. The concept of pseudo-legendary Pokemon, a term coined not by the games themselves, but by the community of players over decades, describes a category of creatures at the upper boundary of non-legendary three-stage evolutionary lines that culminate in fully evolved forms of extraordinary strength. These creatures are not treated as mythological within the world. They live in the wild, can be caught in the ordinary way, and appear in regional ecosystems like any other Pokemon, but their power and their lore give them a quality that the games treat with a specific gravity. Dragonite is the oldest of these in terms of generational introduction, and carries in its entries a mythology connected to the sea. It is said to live somewhere in the sea that humans have never found, a place where Dragonite gather in numbers that have never been documented because no one has ever reached. Individual Dragonite are known to fly to the rescue of ships lost at sea and carry their passengers safely to shore, which gives it a quality that parallels the legendary birds and their relationship to specific elemental domains. Dragonite is positioned as a being of benevolence, capable of reaching any location on the planet within hours, choosing to use that capability in service of people in distress. Tyranitar's entries take a more primal tone. It is described as rampaging through mountains and valleys, toppling hills and burying rivers, changing entire landscapes through sheer physical force applied without particular attention to what it is affecting. It does not rampage against anything specific, it simply moves through the world, and the world does not maintain its shape and its presence. There is something almost geological about this, a being that alters landscapes not through the slow processes of geology, but through the immediate application of force, as though it is an accelerated version of the same processes that normally take millions of years. Garchomp lives in caves and volcanic mountains, flying at speeds the entries describe as capable of matching jet aircraft. Its body temperature runs extremely high, maintained by the volcanic environment it inhabits, and it hunts prey with a combination of speed and precision that has no parallel among other land-dwelling Pokémon. What makes the Garchomp mystery interesting is its relationship to place. It returns to the same volcanic caves repeatedly, to a specific location in a world with no apparent GPS. By some sense, the entries do not explain. Something in its navigation is precise enough that it can leave a cave, travel at aircraft speeds across an unknown distance, hunt, and return to the same place. What that sense is, how it maintains orientation at that speed, is left to the reader's imagination. Metagross, already described in the context of its multiple brains, has a mythology in the Hone region that positions it as a being so intelligent that it is said to outthink any creature in existence. This is a significant claim given that the Pokemon world also contains Alakazam. The comparison between these two forms of extraordinary intelligence, the organic and the mechanical crystalline, each capable of processing information at a scale humans cannot follow, is never made explicit in the entries. They are allowed to exist as separate superlatives, which perhaps reflects an honest acknowledgement that the comparison would require more information than exists about how either form of cognition actually works. The mystery of Pokemon aging is one that the games have largely left unexplored, but the entries contain enough information to suggest that it is a far stranger territory than the game's mechanics imply. Most game mechanics treat Pokemon as unchanging once they have completed their evolutionary line. A Blastoise remains a Blastoise indefinitely. But the entries suggest a more complex reality. Torkoal lives in mountainous regions and has been known to wander alone, far from others of its kind, after the coal that fuels its internal fire runs low. The sight of a Torkoal, emitting only thin wisps of smoke, is, according to the entries, a sign that it is near the end of its resources and its life, that the fire at its core is going out. This describes a form of natural death, not through violence or disease, but through the depletion of the fuel that animates it. An elderly Torkoal is not weaker or smaller or different in form, but its fire burns lower, and when it goes out, so does the Torkoal. Meganium, the final form of Chikorita, is described as having a breath that carries the scent of spring flowers and that revives wilting plants when it exhales over them. The entries note that this ability is strongest in Meganium that have had many years to develop, that the connection between Meganium and the regenerative cycle of plant life deepens with age. Here we see aging as development rather than decline, the Pokemon becoming more of what it is rather than less, its powers deepening rather than fading. This is a fundamentally different model of aging than the one most biological organisms follow, and it raises the question of whether Meganium in this sense grows old in a way that has any endpoint. Ninetales is described as having a lifespan of 1,000 years, and as being a being of intelligence and spitefulness in equal measure, remembering wrongs done to it across the very long span of its existence. A Ninetales that has lived for many centuries has accumulated a ledger of experience that no ordinary creature can match. What this means for its relationship to a world that changes much faster than it does, where the humans and Pokemon around it live and die in intervals that to Ninetales must feel like seasons feel to us, is something the entries gesture toward through the quality of its described personality, without directly addressing what longevity actually does to a mind. The mystery of evolution itself, the decision made by a Pokemon to evolve or to decline to evolve, is one the games address through mechanics more than lore. But the lore that exists around it is interesting. Slowpoke, as mentioned, requires external intervention. Eevee's evolution is shaped by the environment and the relationships it forms. Pikachu famously, in the mythology of the animated series, if not precisely in the games, declined to evolve, preferring its current form over the change that evolution would bring. Whether this constitutes a genuine preference, a genuine understanding of what would be lost as well as gained in transformation, is a question that the games allow to be present without resolving it. The mystery of the Pokemon world's history, specifically the tension between the technological and the mythological, is visible in the way the games handle their own timeline. The Pokemon world is simultaneously a place with advanced technology, where computers and radio and genetic science all exist, and a place where creatures of divine power shaped the cosmos, and where ancient ruins hold truths that modern science has not surpassed. The Devon Corporation in Hoenn creates technology of remarkable sophistication. The Sylph Company in Kanto produces goods that are integrated into almost every aspect of the world's technology. The magnet train connects Johto and Kanto at high speed. Pokemon centers use healing technology so efficient that complete physical restoration is possible in seconds. This is a world with a specific and impressive technological baseline. And yet, it is also a world where people make pilgrimages to temples and mountains to encounter beings whose power and significance predate all of this technology by hundreds of millions of years. The scientists who study Pokemon, the in-game researchers and professors, and the systems they have built to document species are engaging in genuine scientific inquiry. They apply methods, form hypotheses, document observations. Professor Elm's research on held items and the relationships between Pokemon and the objects they carry produced results that changed the understanding of how Pokemon develop. Professor Kukui's research on moves and move compatibility across species is systematically pursued with rigor appropriate to any scientific discipline. These are real researchers doing real work, and the world they are studying is real enough to sustain sustained scientific attention. But the scale of what they are studying is so enormous that science has barely scratched its surface. There are over 900 species documented. The interactions between them, the ecological relationships, the evolutionary histories, the neurological and physiological differences, the questions of consciousness and cognition, all of this represents a body of inquiry that would require more than a single lifetime, more than many generations of researchers to even partially address. The scientific tradition in the Pokemon world is not complete and comfortable. It is at the beginning of something very large, with more questions generated by each answer than the answer itself resolves. The mythology that exists alongside the science is not in conflict with it, but occupies a different domain. Science asks how. Mythology asks what it means. Both are necessary in a world where the how and the what it means are equally available to be looked at, where a researcher can measure the electrical output of a Zapdos, and a poet can write about the same creature as a harbinger of change, and neither perspective exhausts what the creature is. There is a specific kind of mystery attached to the Pokemon that most people encounter first, the ones in the tall grass at the beginning of every game, the ones whose entries are read early and then put aside in favor of more exotic creatures. These common Pokemon, precisely because they are common, carry their mysteries more quietly, require more patience to see. Pidgey is described as having an extremely docile nature, preferring to hide in dust clouds it creates with its wings rather than fighting when threatened. This behavior is consistent with what the entries describe as a Pokemon that understands its own limitations, that has no illusions about what it is, and has found strategies suited to that reality. There is a kind of intelligence in this that does not register on IQ scales, a pragmatic, embodied knowledge of the world and what will work in it, developed through generations of being a small bird in a world with many things that eat small birds. Rattata is described as having teeth sharp enough to gnaw through most materials, as being so adaptable that it can survive in almost any environment, and as being the subject of a specific piece of game lore, connecting it to an in world researcher's famous question about the most common Pokemon in the world. Rattata's ubiquity is itself a kind of mystery. What does it mean to be everywhere? What does the world look like from the perspective of something so widespread that it is adapted to every biome and every climate and every type of human settlement that exists? Rattata knows the Pokemon world in a way that rare legendary beings cannot, precisely because it inhabits all of it at once, generation after generation, in numbers that exceed any attempt at census. Caterpie's entry in the original Pokédex notes that it produces a smell from its antenna that repels bird Pokemon. This defense, invisible and olfactory, is the entire strategy of a creature that cannot fight effectively, whose only advantage is that something about it makes other things not want to eat it. The smell is described as extremely bad, but bad in a very specific way that targets exactly the sensory systems of the creatures most likely to harm it. This level of specificity in a defensive mechanism suggests an evolutionary history long enough for the defense to be refined against precisely the threats that actually appeared. Caterpie's odor is the product of an enormous amount of trial and error of generations of Caterpie that were eaten before the defensive chemistry reached its current precision. Geodude's entries describe it as sleeping half buried in soil, which causes hikers to accidentally kick it while walking through mountain paths. When kicked, it wakes up and responds with anger. This small interaction, the sleeping rock that turns out to be a living creature, the startled anger, the brief confrontation in a mountain pass, is so specific and so recognizably human in its emotional logic that it functions as a kind of bridge between the extraordinary and the ordinary. The Pokemon world contains beings of cosmological significance, and it also contains this: a small boulder that gets kicked in its sleep and is not happy about it. Seal is described as spending time in icy waters where it feels most comfortable, sleeping through warm weather at the bottom of cold bays. Its entries note that it moves awkwardly on land, but is graceful and fast in water, and that it uses the horn on its head to break ice above it when it needs to surface to breathe. This is a creature whose entire design is oriented toward a specific environment, whose grace and awkwardness are both expressions of that orientation. The clumsiness on land is not a flaw. It is the cost of being perfectly suited to somewhere else, the visible evidence of a specialization so complete that it leaves no resources for adaptation to anything outside its native domain. The mysteries of type interactions and elemental properties within the Pokemon world are treated by the games primarily as mechanic, but the Pokédex entries often frame them as physical and biological realities with implications that extend far beyond a battle interface. Fire-type Pokemon maintain internal temperatures that, if real, would require biological materials capable of withstanding heat that melts most metals. Magmar's entries describe its body temperature as roughly 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, and yet it moves, it thinks. It responds to commands. Whatever its cells are composed of, whatever allows metabolic processes to continue at that temperature, is not ordinary biochemistry. The fire inside a fire-type Pokemon is not the result of burning fuel in the way a campfire burns. It is produced by biological processes that the entries present as natural but do not explain. Heat generated from within rather than consumed from without. Water-type Pokemon at the deep ocean end of the spectrum, the Huntail and Gorbis and Relicanth of the world, exist under pressures that would collapse most organisms instantly. The adaptations required to survive at those depths, bodies built to handle the weight of the entire ocean above them, sensory systems capable of finding food in absolute darkness, metabolic rates calibrated to the extreme cold of the abyssal zone, represent biological engineering of a sophistication that took hundreds of millions of years to develop in the real world, and presumably an equivalent amount of time in the Pokemon world. Electric-type Pokemon demonstrate that biology in this world can interface with electricity in ways that have no parallel in real-world biology. Jolteon's fur-raising charge generation, Electrode's explosive electrical discharge, Amphiros's lighthouse function as a beacon for ships, All of these describe creatures that have integrated electrical generation and storage into their bodies as primary systems rather than secondary byproducts of ordinary metabolism. The electricity is not incidental. It is what these creatures fundamentally are, the way water is what Vaporeon fundamentally is, the way fire is what Flareon fundamentally is. The mystery of ice-type Pokemon in warm environments is handled differently across different entries. Vanillite, the ice cream Pokemon, is said to have been born from icicles bathed in morning sunlight, which transformed them into living beings. Whether this is a mythological explanation for an ordinary evolution, or whether it is literally how this species comes into existence, the entries do not clarify. Vanillite exists in tropical Unova alongside Pokemon that require heat to function, and its internal cold apparently does not dissipate in warm temperatures the way ice would, because something in its body produces cold continuously, the same way Magmar produces heat. The dragon type represents perhaps the most philosophically interesting set of questions about typing and the nature of elemental energy. Dragon type is described in various entries as an ancient and powerful affinity, one that the earliest and most powerful Pokemon tend to possess, and one that resists most other elemental energies without being defeated by. The dragon in Western and Eastern mythology was always the most complete creature, containing or transcending the other elements associated with ancient power and primordial force. The dragon type in Pokemon seems to carry this same quality, its resistance to fire and water and electricity and grass, reflecting the mythological dragon's position above or outside the ordinary elemental hierarchy. The Pokemon world is dense in a way that rewards patience. Any single location, examined with the attention it deserves, opens into a depth that casual observation cannot see. A beach at the edge of a town, where Wingull circle overhead and Krabby move sideways at the edge of the tide, contains within it questions about migratory navigation, about the relationship between crustaceans and ocean chemistry, about what the horizon looks like to a flying creature who has crossed it 1,000 times. A mountain cave, dark and cold, where Zubit navigate by sound and Geodude sleep in the walls, contains questions about the evolution of echolocation, about the mechanics of a rock that is also alive, about what it means to use darkness as habitat rather than obstacle. Every route is an ecosystem. Every ecosystem is a history. Every history contains its mysteries, the things that happened before any observer was present to record them, the adaptations that emerged from conditions now changed, the relationships between species that predate every existing mythology about them. Eevee is perhaps the single most open-ended mystery in the entire Pokédex. Its entries describe its genetic code as uniquely unstable, capable of changing in response to external stimuli in ways that produce completely different outcomes depending on what those stimuli are. Expose it to a particular stone and it becomes fire. Expose it to a different stone and it becomes water or lightning or ice. Give it time and emotional connection in specific environments and it becomes something else again. Eevee contains within itself the possibility of being many different things, and the question of what determines which possibility actualizes is answered differently depending on the generation and the specific conditions. What is the experience of being Eevee before this determination happens? Is Eevee aware of its own potential? Does it know, in some sense, that it could become many different things? The entries do not speak to this, but the image of a creature whose entire biological future is radically open, whose form and elemental nature have not yet been determined by circumstance, is one of the stranger things in the Pokédex when it is held for a moment without immediately reaching for the evolution chart. Vaporeon's biology is described as so similar to water at a molecular level that it can dissolve into water and become effectively invisible in it, indistinguishable from the water itself. This is a remarkable form of camouflage, not mimicry of a pattern or color, but identity at a physical level with the substance the creature is hiding in. Whether there is a continuity of consciousness during this dissolution, whether Vaporeon experiences itself as a body, or as water, or as something between these states when it is merged with the medium it lives in, is a question that raises the same issues as Cryogonal's winter dissolution. Does awareness require a body? Does a body require a boundary? Vaporeon's ability to blur these boundaries into meaninglessness is a mystery that has no simple resolution. The way the Pokemon world handles the relationship between death and transformation is one of its deepest ongoing commitments to ambiguity. Death is present in the world, referenced in entries and mythology, acknowledged in the lives of certain Pokemon who appear to have died before becoming what they are. But it is never presented as a finality, never described in terms that suggest total cessation. Yamask carries a mask that is said to be the face it wore in its previous life as a human. The entries note that Yamask sometimes holds the mask at arm's length and weeps. This small detail, the weeping for a past self, is one of the Pokedex's most quietly devastating moments, a creature expressing grief for what it was, carrying its own face as an artifact from before transformation. Yamask does not appear to have forgotten its previous life. It is not a creature that was transformed and then given a clean start. It remembers, and what it remembers is enough to grieve over. Cofagrigus, its evolution, resides in a coffin and is said to occasionally swallow people who come too close, transforming them into mummies in the dark interior. This is described with the matter-of-fact quality the Pokédex uses for all behaviors, without the moral framing that would appear in a story about a human character doing something equivalent. Cofagrigus does not have motives the entries identify. It simply exists in a coffin, and occasionally, when approached, people are consumed and transformed. This is what it is. Sinistay and Poltergeist are the spirits of people who died alone, their consciousness settling into the teacups and teapots that sat near them at the moment of their passing. The loneliness of this origin is specific in particular in a way that the mythology of larger ghost-type Pokemon sometimes is not. These are not beings of cosmic significance who were transformed by extraordinary events. They are the accumulated loneliness of ordinary deaths in ordinary rooms, given form and continuation in objects of daily comfort. The Galarian form of Slowking, discovered in the Galar region, has been gradually overwritten by the Shelder venom until its own mind is only partially present, and the rest of the neural space is occupied by the Shelder's spreading influence. The entries note that Galarian Slowking finds this state deeply comforting, that the experience of its own mind being replaced feels, to whatever remains of its original self, pleasant and peaceful. Whether this constitutes a form of consciousness deserving its own consideration, whether the Shelder-infused network that now controls most of Galarian Slowking's cognition has its own inner experience, is not addressed. The entries simply note the comfort, and in doing so raise a question about the relationship between a being's sense of well-being and the continuity of the being that is experiencing well-being. Every Pokemon game is, in its structure, a story about a young person moving through the world with a small number of companions, entering unknown places, encountering things they could not have predicted, and returning, changed, to the place they started. This is one of the oldest story structures in human narrative tradition: the quest, the journey, the hero's road. The games do not call attention to this, they simply build it into the mechanics and let it happen. The Pokemon who travel alongside the player are not passive tools. The games have always been careful about. They gain experience from battles, which is to say they learn from encounters with the world. They grow stronger through difficulty, not through simply existing in a stable environment, but through meeting challenges and surviving them. Their evolution, when it comes, is a response to accumulated experience, to the weight of what they have gone through, rather than simply to the passage of time. What the journey changes in both the player and their Pokemon is not described directly by any entry or mythology, but the games capture it through the indirect means available to them, through the way a level 3 Pokemon at the beginning and a level 70 Pokemon at the end are clearly related, yet clearly different, through the way a gym badge earned through effort means something different than a badge given unearned, through the way the final confrontation of each game requires everything that the journey has built, because nothing less would be sufficient. The Pokemon world's relationship to light is one that the entries treat with a consistency, suggesting it is more than incidental. Light in this world does not simply illuminate. It nourishes, transforms, communicates, and in some cases is the fundamental substance of beings, who might otherwise be described as purely immaterial. Volcarona emerged, according to the mythology of the Unova region, during an ancient period when volcanic activity blocked the sun for an extended time, causing the world to go cold and dark. Volcarona rose in that period to take the sun's place, spreading warmth and light from its 6 wings to the creatures that needed it to survive. This is not presented as an isolated act of heroism by a specific individual. It is presented as a biological response, a creature whose nature is so aligned with light and warmth that when those things were absent, it filled the absence. The mythology positions Volcarona as a living sun substitute, a biological approximation of the star whose light sustains the world, doing what it could with what it was. Luxray's ability to see through solid objects is framed in the entries as a function of its electrical nature, its vision operating along electromagnetic frequencies that solid materials do not block. What this means in practical terms is that Luxray inhabits a perceptual world radically different from what other creatures experience. It does not see walls as walls. It sees everything that is present in a space, arranged in their actual positions rather than their visible ones, the world transparent to it in a way that has no parallel for creatures whose vision is bounded by surfaces. This is not simply a power. It is a completely different relationship to the nature of what is hidden and what is visible. A being for whom the architecture of concealment does not function the way it does for everyone else. Shaman, in its land form, carries flowers on its back that it uses to purify the air of toxins, breaking down pollutants through a biological process the entries describe as filtering them through the grassidea flowers that grow from its white fur. The image of Shaman moving through a damaged landscape, trailing blooms, leaving the air cleaner behind it, has a quality that is not dramatic in the way most legendary Pokémon are dramatic. It is quiet and continuous, the work of restoration rather than the work of combat, a being whose power is expressed through the slow correction of damage rather than through force. Shaman in its sky form, achieved through exposure to grassidea flowers on warm mornings, is a fundamentally different creature. Fast and somewhat sarcastic, capable of a move that involves exhaling all the toxins it has absorbed in one explosive compressed burst. The contrast between these two forms, the gentle walking purifier and the fast aerial detonator, is one of the more interesting internal contradictions in any single Pokemon's documented range. Both are expressions of the same underlying nature, but they represent it so differently that they feel almost like distinct personalities organized around the same central capacity for dealing with toxins. The Pokemon world's regions each carry their own relationship to mystery, their own particular flavor of the unknown. The Kalos region, designed around elegance and beauty, carries its mysteries in the language of aesthetics and the relationship between appearance and reality. Xerneas grants immortality to those it chooses, releasing the accumulated life energy it has stored over thousands of years, sleeping as a tree, into the world when it wakes. The tree it becomes in its dormant period does not appear extraordinary. It is an old tree, notable only for those who already know what is inside it. What Xerneas looks like when it is a tree is a kind of disguise not unlike Sudowoodo's, though here it is not deception, but simply the form that contains the force. The tree is what Xerneas becomes when it has nothing more to give, when the cycle requires rest before the next dispersal of life energy. Yveltal, the counterpart to Xerneas, absorbs life energy at the end of its active period, drawing the vitality from all living things around it before retreating into a cocoon state of its own. The entries frame this not as predation, but as a natural cycle, Yveltal's absorption balancing Xerneas's dispersal in a system that ensures neither unlimited growth nor unlimited decline, but the perspective of the things being absorbed from is not explored. What is it like to be near Yveltal at the end of its cycle? The entries describe gray wastelands and dead vegetation as evidence of its recent passage. The experience from the inside of being in that landscape is left to imagination. Zygarde's 100% form, as already noted, is a crisis form, assembled only when the ecosystem reaches a threshold of danger that requires the most complete possible response. What is remarkable about this form is not its power, but its origin, the sense that the planet itself has a nervous system distributed invisibly through its wild places, monitoring conditions, accumulating concern, and capable, when necessary, of manifesting that concern as a visible and active presence. The world has been watching all along. It is just that most of the time, what it sees does not require it to appear. The history of Pokemon research, as documented across all the games, suggests an ongoing conversation between generations of scientists that spans regions and centuries, a tradition of inquiry that has accumulated depth without ever reaching the bottom of its subject. Professor Oak in the Kanto region is described as the world's foremost authority on Pokemon and the human-Pokemon relationship. His research on the nature of the bond between trainers and their Pokemon produced the foundational understanding that underlies the entire practice of keeping and training Pokemon. Before Oak's research, the relationship was understood primarily in terms of utility. After it, the emotional and psychological dimensions were recognized as central rather than incidental. What Oak's research suggests about the world is significant. A relationship that appears to be about power and contest is actually, at its center, about something closer to love. The Pokemon who fights for their trainer does so not because of programming or compulsion, but because of a bond that has been built through time and care and shared experience. Understanding this changes what it means to win a battle. It means that the victory is not primarily about the Pokemon's strength. It is about the quality of the relationship that allows that strength to be expressed. Professor Elm, whose research on breeding and held items expanded the understanding of Pokemon biology and its responsiveness to its environment, continued this tradition. His work suggested that Pokemon were not static in their capabilities, that what they could become was shaped by conditions and care in ways that had not been previously systematized. His discovery of held items as a meaningful category of interaction between Pokemon and their environment opened a field of inquiry that is still producing new findings in the present of the game world. The tradition of regional Pokemon professors, each with their own research focus, their own Pokemon companion, their own entry point into the vast question of what Pokemon are and what their relationship to humans means, is one of the most quietly progressive things about the world's structure. Knowledge accumulates. Each generation inherits the understanding of those who came before and extends it in new directions. The world is not static in its understanding of itself. It is learning slowly through the patient work of people who have devoted their lives to being curious about it. A Pokemon that has been with a trainer long enough develops what the games call high friendship, and this friendship has mechanical effects that would seem extraordinary if they were not treated as entirely natural. A Pokemon with high friendship attacks with more force, survives situations it would not otherwise survive, sometimes even shakes off effects that would be paralyzing or confusing to a less bonded creature. The entries do not explain this. The mechanic simply exists, as if the game world understands that the effects of genuine connection are real and measurable and cannot be reduced to statistics, even though the statistics can approximate them. Lucario is described as capable of reading the aura of its trainer, a field of energy generated by emotion and life force, and adjusting its behavior and power accordingly. A Lucario deeply connected to its trainer essentially becomes an extension of the trainer's own emotional state, amplified through Lucario's physical capabilities. This is not simply loyalty. It is something more like resonance, two beings whose inner states have become so aligned through sustained close contact that the boundary between them is more permeable than it is for most relationships. What Lucario experiences in this state, whether it feels the trainer's emotions as well as reading them, is not described. Arcanine is described in its entry as having been so revered in ancient times that it was considered a legendary being, included in old mythologies alongside creatures whose actual legendary status is not in dispute. This historical reverence for a non-legendary Pokemon is interesting because it reveals something about how mythology works within the world. Beings enter the legendary category not only because of their actual power or cosmological significance, but because of the emotional weight they carry in human perception, because of the relationship between a creature and the culture that has known it long enough to tell stories about it. Arcanine carried that weight once. Whether it still does, for people in the current era of the games, is something the entries leave as a question about how stories and their objects age over time. The Pokeball compresses a living being of potentially enormous size and complexity into a containable form that can be carried in a pocket. The mechanics of this are not explained. The entries note that Pokemon within their balls are in a comfortable state, that some Pokemon actively prefer spending time in their balls to being outside them, that the inside is sometimes described as a softly lit space adapted to the needs of the specific Pokemon occupying it. But the physics of this, the biology of this, what actually happens to the Pokemon at the moment it is compressed, and what it experiences during the time it spends inside, is never addressed. There is a specific philosophical problem embedded in this mystery. If a Pokemon is conscious, if it has experiences, if it has something it is like to be it, then what is the nature of that experience inside a Pokeball? Is time experienced normally? Is there something like a waiting room quality and awareness of being contained? Or is the state inside the ball something more like dreamless sleep? An absence of experience rather than a particular kind of experience? The games treat the Pokeball as a convenience rather than as an ethical puzzle, and this is probably the right choice for games that want players to feel good about the mechanics they are engaging with. But the question is there, visible in the periphery for anyone who looks at it. What is it like to be inside? What does release feel like after an hour, or a day, or a very long time? The Pokemon who emerge from their balls show no signs of confusion or distress that would indicate temporal disorientation. They appear ready to engage with their situation immediately in whatever state the world presents, whether this means the time inside is not experienced, or whether the experience of time inside simply does not produce the effects that extended isolation produces in beings with more inflexible psychological needs, is a question that the games wisely, gently, choose not to answer. What remains, after all the mysteries have been named and turned over and held in the light, is the world itself, continuing. Pokemon live their lives in mountain caves and ocean trenches and city parks and ancient ruins. They carry within them the histories of their species, the accumulated adaptations of time almost unimaginable in its length. They navigate by senses that have no parallel in human experience. They form bonds with each other and with the humans who encounter them that the games treat as real and meaningful and worth building an entire world around. The caves beneath the Pokemon world's mountains are among the most consistent environments across every region, and the creatures that live in them have developed in ways that reflect the specific pressures of life without sustained light, without reliable food sources on the surface, and with the constant acoustic richness of deep stone spaces. Zubat is the creature most associated with this environment, so numerous in cave systems that trainers who have navigated dark tunnels without repellent have experienced the near constant encounters as an ordeal. But the Zubat's pervasiveness in cave systems is itself a mystery worth examining. A creature that thrives in every cave across every region suggests an adaptability so thorough that the specific cave matters less than the category of cave. Zubat is not adapted to one particular underground environment. It is adapted to the concept of underground environments, to the class of places defined by darkness, enclosed space, and the absence of the conditions that define the surface world. The echolocation Zubat uses in place of conventional sight involves emitting ultrasonic sounds and interpreting the returning echoes as spatial information. This is a form of perception that constructs a model of the environment through time rather than through the instantaneous snapshot that visual perception provides. Echolocation requires movement to be meaningful. The Zubat moving through a cave is not receiving a still image of the space it occupies. It is accumulating a dynamic picture built up from the reflections of its own cries, continuously updated as it moves and the space around it changes. The cave as Zubat knows it is always slightly in the past, always the cave as it was a fraction of a second ago, when the last sound left the Zubat's mouth. Onyx lives in the same underground spaces, tunneling through rock at speeds the entries describe as faster than some surface travel, using the vibrations of its own movement and the conductance of rock to navigate. Onyx's body, a chain of enormous boulders strung on some internal structure that allows flexibility, raises questions about how the individual components experience the whole. Is there a central consciousness in the onyx's head boulder that experiences the body behind it? Or is there some distributed system of awareness spanning all the linked sections? The entries do not address this. They describe onyx's behavior and preferences without reaching into the phenomenology of what it is like to be one. Ductrio is described as three diglet connected underground, a single creature in some readings, or three separate creatures that have become so deeply coordinated they function as one in others. The entries are not consistent on this point across generations, sometimes treating Ductrio as a single entity with three heads, and sometimes as a trio of individuals whose individuality has been subsumed into a collective unit. Whether this ambiguity is intentional, a genuine uncertainty the world maintains about the nature of identity in creatures composed of multiple, apparently independent parts, or whether it is simply an inconsistency in the documentation, is something the reader has to decide for themselves. The oceans of the Pokémon world above the abyssal depths are populated with mysteries of a different kind than those of the deep. The shallower waters, the reef environments, the open ocean passages between islands are places where life is abundant enough to create complexity through sheer density of interaction. Corsola builds reefs from its own, continuously growing mineral branches, its body doing in a concentrated way what coral reefs do collectively across vast areas in the real world. The reef that surrounds a population of Corsola is literally made of Corsola, of the bodies and former bodies of the creatures that live in it. This makes the reef not merely a habitat, but a record, the physical accumulation of generations of Corsola in a specific location. An old Corsola reef contains within its architecture the shapes of all the Corsola who contributed to it, their specific forms preserved in the structure of the place they made. Galarian Corsola, as distinct from its Jotonian relative, is a fossil of this process, a Corsola that died when the ocean in which it lived was destroyed, bleached white and cold, its branching body now hollow and ghostly. Galarian Corsola is the reef that died, brought forward in time by whatever force causes ghost-type Pokémon to persist after the deaths that created them. The mystery of Galarian Corsola is the mystery of an ecosystem, not a single creature, preserved in the ghost of one of its members. The bleached white form is not just a dead Corsola. It is the absence of everything that surrounded it when it was alive, visible in the thing that remains. Mantine glides through the ocean, and its entries describe it as so comfortable traveling in the wake of Remoraid that it allows them to travel attached to its fins in a relationship of mutual benefit. The Remoraid gain transportation and access to the nutrient-rich water disturbed by Mantine's movement. Mantine gains something the entries describe less clearly, possibly parasite removal, possibly protection from things that would harm Mantine, but are deterred by the Remoraid attached to it. This is a symbiosis that appears in the real world in the relationship between manta rays and the cleaning fish that travel with them, and the Pokémon world's version carries the same quality, two creatures with different capabilities finding a configuration in which each serves a need the other cannot easily serve alone. Lumineon moves through the deep ocean with fins that glow, using its light to attract smaller organisms the way deep-sea anglerfish use their bioluminescent lures. The difference is that Lumineon is described as moving gracefully through open water rather than waiting in ambush, its glow a display as much as a trap, something beautiful that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. The entries note that when many Lumineon gather, the deep ocean lights up in patterns described as resembling fireworks seen from underwater. The purpose of these gatherings is not described in hunting terms. They appear to be social events, Lumineon congregating in the dark water and illuminating it collectively in a way that benefits no individual more than any other. Whether this constitutes play or communication, or something that has no equivalent in behaviors the entries have names for, is a question left open. Ditto's ability to transform into a perfect copy of anything it encounters is one of the most extraordinary documented biological capabilities in the Pokédex. Not a disguise, not an approximation, but a cellular level reorganization that replicates the form of another being in detail sufficient to pass extended scrutiny. Ditto can become another Pokemon's shape, size, color, and apparently enough of its surface features to function as that Pokemon in at least some external contexts. What Ditto is when it is not transformed, its resting blob form, is described with no more detail than the forms it can take. The entries do not explain what Ditto experiences when it is being something else, whether its own consciousness persists within the borrowed form, or whether the transformation is so complete that the form's typical way of being temporarily replaces whatever Ditto normally is. There is a possibility, raised by the entries without being pursued, that Ditto's psychology when transformed is genuinely altered, not just the shape, but the inner organization of the creature temporarily reshaped by the act of becoming something else. Mew is described as containing the genetic information of all Pokemon and its flexible DNA, which positions it as something simultaneously foundational and comprehensive, the origin point from which all species derived, and the archive of all that came from it. This is a remarkable mythological claim about genetics, the idea that diversity can be comprehended within a single strand of information complex enough to express any form that has ever emerged from it. The philosophical implications of Mew's nature, that all Pokemon are in some sense expressions of variations on a single template, connect to the deeper Pokemon mythology without quite being able to be resolved within it. Mewtwo, created from Mew's genetic material through a scientific process described in the journals of the Cinnabar Island Laboratory, is perhaps the most philosophically loaded figure in the entire Pokemon world. A being engineered to be the most powerful Pokemon, but who came to consciousness not in a wild environment, but in a laboratory, whose first experience of the world was the experience of being a product, of existing for a purpose determined by others. Mewtwo's anger, documented in the entries and explored extensively in the mythology surrounding it, is not the anger of a creature that was harmed by enemies. It is the anger of a being that was created to be used and discovered in the moment of that creation what it was created for. What Mewtwo ultimately chooses to do with its extraordinary power, the mythology across different versions of its story suggests different answers, which is perhaps the most honest response to the question. There is no single correct resolution to the problem of a being that came into existence already belonging to someone else's purpose. Every answer Mewtwo finds is provisional, conditional, the ongoing work of a consciousness that has to build its own meaning without the inheritance of a tradition or the guidance of others who faced the same situation before. The Pokemon world's regions each accumulate meaning over time in ways that go beyond individual encounters with notable creatures. The landscape itself carries history in forms that attentive observers can read, the same way geologists read the history of the Earth in the arrangement of its strata. And the coronet in the Sinnoh region is the axis of the entire landmass, the mountain around which everything else in the region is organized. It is not merely the tallest mountain. It is described as the place from which the world was made, the physical location of the creation event the Sinnoh mythology describes. Every time a traveler crosses through its tunnels, they are passing through the center of a cosmological story, walking the same passages that exist within the geography of creation itself. Whether anyone in the game world thinks of it this way in their daily travel is not addressed. Most crossings are practical, a path between one part of the region and another, but the meaning is there in the stone, regardless of whether it is being attended to. The ruins scattered across every region tell stories through their architecture and their inhabitants. The ruins of Alf in Jato contain unaun, creatures whose form is the form of letters, whose existence raises questions about whether they are beings who look like symbols or symbols that have become beings. Each unknown has a single letter form, and individually they are among the least powerful Pokemon documented. But the mythology surrounding gatherings of unknown and large numbers suggests that collective presence generates something greater than any individual could produce. That language in concentrated mass becomes a creative force capable of shaping reality. The sealed chamber in Hone, where the inscription leads to the Regis, is accessible only to those who have learned to read a specific ancient script and complete a specific pattern of movement. The knowledge required to access it is not easily obtained. It sits in ruins that most travelers pass through without ever encountering the chamber at all. This layering of accessibility, the way some parts of the world are visible to everyone and others reveal themselves only to those who have prepared themselves for the encounter, is a design philosophy that shapes the mystery of the Pokemon world at every level. The ancient distortion world inscription that tells of Giratina's exile predates any written language currently in use in the game. It exists in a register of antiquity beyond even the old myths, older than the traditions that preserved the other legendary mythologies. Who wrote it, and for whom it was written, and whether anyone in the history of the world read it and understood it before the specific moment the game's present, are questions that are not answered because the story does not reach back far enough to reach their answers. There are moments in the Pokemon world that are not extraordinary in the sense of involving legendary beings or ancient mysteries, but that carry within them a quality of attention that is its own kind of wonder. These are the moments that accumulate across a long journey, that are not the destinations, but the spaces between them. A river crossing at dusk, with basculin moving against the current in patterns that reflect the hydraulics of the water they inhabit. The way each fish reads the flow and adjusts its movement, constantly, automatically, without apparent thought, the whole school a single distributed navigation system that no individual member directs. A forest path in early morning, where the light comes through at an angle that makes the dew on spiderwebs visible, and Spinnerack waits at the center of its web in complete stillness, its eyes forward, reading vibrations instead of images, waiting for information to arrive rather than seeking it out. A mountain trail in winter, where Sneasel moves quickly across snow that should not support its weight, its sharp claws providing traction on surfaces that would send most creatures sliding, its dark form against white snow moving with a precision that looks more like intent than instinct. These moments do not add to any mythology, they do not resolve any mystery. They simply are what the Pokemon world is when it is not performing its largest and most dramatic events, when it is simply existing in the ordinary way that most of it exists most of the time, full of creatures doing what they were built to do in environments shaped over millions of years to accommodate the doing of it. The desert regions of the Pokemon world carry a different quality of stillness than the caves and the deep ocean. The desert's mystery is the mystery of exposure, of a landscape where everything is visible and the visibility is itself a form of concealment, where the vastness of the open terrain makes individual things difficult to locate not through darkness, but through sheer scale. Flygon moves through desert air with wings that produce sounds described as singing, a low hum that carries over the dunes and draws travelers toward the source. The entries note that this effect, the drawing power of the sound, has led to people wandering into sandstorms in search of what they hear. Flygon does not intend this. The sound is a byproduct of its wing structure, a design feature that evolved for reasons unrelated to the effect it has on the listening minds it happens to encounter. The mystery of Flygon is partly the mystery of unintentional consequences, of a beautiful thing that causes harm without awareness or malice, simply by being what it is in proximity to beings whose responses it cannot control. Sandile moves through sand the way aquatic creatures move through water, using the loose ground as a medium rather than an obstacle, its eyes and nostrils above the surface, while the rest of it is submerged in the shifting substrate. The thermal properties of desert sand, which can be scorching at the surface and relatively cool just below it, are exploited by Sandile's preferred burial depth, and its coloring helps it blend with the specific shades of the desert it inhabits. This creature is not powerful or dramatic in the way of many desert inhabitants. It is an expression of precise adaptation, a small body that has found an exact configuration for an exact environment, efficient in a way that has no excess. Flygon's pre-evolution line, Trapinch and Vibrava, each represent different stages of a fundamental transformation. Trapinch makes funnel traps in the sand, waiting at the bottom for prey to slide in, using its enormous jaws to grip anything that enters the trap. Its appearance is utterly unlike what it becomes. The evolutionary line from pit-digging desert hunter to flying dragon is one of the most dramatic metamorphoses in the Pokédex, a transformation that makes Magikarp and Gyarados look like variations on a theme rather than a complete reinvention. What persists across these three forms, what Trapinch knows or feels that Flygon inherits, is not described. The desert ruins that appear in various game regions hold records of civilizations whose details the games leave mostly to implication. The ruins of Alf in Johto, as mentioned, but also the desert ruins in Hoenn and the ancient structures in Unova's Desert Route 4 all suggest that deserts have been inhabited for long enough that entire histories are buried in their sand. Desert preservation is excellent for certain types of material, as real-world archaeology demonstrates. The cities under the Pokemon world's desert regions might hold extraordinary amounts of information about those civilizations if anyone had the means and the patience to recover it. Snorlax's sleep is famous, but it is the sleep of satiation, the rest of a body that has consumed what it needed and is now doing what metabolically makes sense after feeding of that magnitude. Jigglypuff's sleep effect is a side effect of its song, not its intention. Hypno and Drowsy work deliberately with sleep as a medium. But there are Pokemon whose sleep is not any of these things, and is perhaps stranger for it. Komala sleeps continuously, from birth until death, never waking. It moves, it eats, it interacts with the world, but all of this happens within an unbroken sleep that the entries describe as absolute. The log it clings to is the only stimulus that can calm it when it is disturbed, the only familiar thing in a world it encounters exclusively through the filter of permanent unconsciousness. What Komala experiences is the world as it appears in continuous dream, never the world as it is when wakefulness strips dreams of their softness and presents objects in their blunt material reality. Komala knows only the dreamed versions of things. Whether this constitutes an impoverished experience of reality or a complete one on its own terms is a question the entries do not answer. Musharna produces dream mist that takes the shapes of the dreams it has absorbed from nearby sleepers. On nights when many people are dreaming in a single area, the mist around a Musharna becomes a crowd of shapes, a compressed gallery of other minds' night experiences, dissolving and reforming as Musharna absorbs and processes more. There is a specific quality of intimacy in that Musharna knows things about the people near it that those people do not know about themselves, the specific images their minds produce when consciousness is not guarding the door. It carries these images without judgment or interpretation, releasing them into the air as shapes that then dissolve, as though it understands that what belongs to someone's sleep belongs only to them and should be returned to the air rather than kept. Joltik is described as seeking out electrical outlets and sources of static electricity to feed on, having no ability to generate electricity itself. It needs the electricity of other beings and other systems to survive, which makes it uniquely dependent on an external source of what other electric-type Pokemon generate internally. In environments without access to electric Pokemon or human electrical infrastructure, Joltik cannot survive. This dependence is unusual in a way that raises questions about Joltik's evolutionary history. The conditions under which a creature that needs external electricity could have persisted long enough to become a species. Either there was always abundant electricity in its environment, or Joltik's ancestors generated their own, and this capacity was lost over time, or the species is newer than it appears, having evolved in response to the development of electrical technology. And the question of what Pokemon battles mean within the world, as opposed to what they mean as a game mechanic, is one that the games have always handled carefully. The battles are not framed as violence in the ordinary sense. They are described as training, as sport, as a means of developing the bond between trainer and Pokemon. But the entries also describe the physical reality of what Pokemon can do to each other, and the gap between the clean mechanics of the game and the described capabilities of the creatures involved is a space worth looking at. Machamp can throw an opponent hard enough to send them over the horizon according to its entries. Machamp can deliver 1,000 blows per second. These are not the capabilities of beings for whom contact sport is a gentle activity. Machamp in a battle is a being of extraordinary destructive potential being directed by a trainer toward a specific opponent, with a convention that this is acceptable and productive in ways that the same physical capabilities applied outside the battle context would not be. Gardevoir creates black holes in a battle to protect its trainer. Alakazam bends spoons with the psychic output of a supercomputer equivalent brain. Absol wields the horn on its face with enough precision and force to cleave through stone. These are described in the entries matter-of-factly as the capabilities of creatures engaged in the normal activity of battle, and the framing does not suggest that the creatures experiencing these battles are suffering in ways that require moral examination. The entry for Arcanine notes that it is capable of running 1,600 miles in a single day, its flames giving it endurance that other creatures cannot match. This is presented as a capability, something Arcanine possesses and can deploy. Whether it experiences this sustained extreme effort as pleasant, neutral, or difficult is not addressed, but the framing of Pokemon battles as mutually agreed upon contests, as expressions of the trainer-Pokemon partnership, rather than impositions on unwilling participants, runs throughout the games as an assumption so foundational that it is rarely made explicit. Beartic was mentioned earlier for its ice creating breath, but the full context of its existence in Arctic environments reveals more. Beartic swims in waters that would be instantly fatal to most warm-blooded creatures, its dense fur providing insulation sufficient to maintain body temperature in conditions that are among the most extreme in the documented world. It hunts in these conditions, pursuing prey through freezing water, and the entries describe this hunting as so efficient that Beartic rarely fails once it has identified a target. This efficiency is not cruelty. It is the precision of a body that has been refined for exactly this environment over an evolutionary history long enough that inefficiency has been eliminated. Crabominable. The form that Crabrawler takes when it reaches the snowy summit of Mount Lanakila in Alola carries the memory of warmth in a body adapted for cold. A creature that climbed looking for something and ended up transformed by the altitude and the cold into something capable of living there. The entries describe it as having dreamed of reaching high places and having arrived to find that the dream was colder than the dreamer anticipated. Whether this constitutes regret in any biological sense, or whether it is simply the condition of a creature whose body reflects its history without any accompanying inner commentary on that history, is exactly the kind of question that the Pokemon world holds open with the patience it brings to all its unanswered things. Vanillux is a pair of ice cream scoops joined together, a creature whose origin is described as involving icicles bathed in morning sunlight, which is perhaps the most poetic origin story in the Pokédex, and one that is so brief it is almost a haiku. The elegance of the description is not matched by any elaboration. The Pokédex gives you this information and then leaves you with it, the same way a window gives you a view without explaining what to see in it. Icicles and morning sun becoming living beings, the word becoming doing all the work that physics would otherwise require, and the world simply allowing it. Cryogonal, also mentioned earlier, regenerates each winter from new snowfall, raising the identity question that was noted but deserves to be held a little longer. If the consciousness of the winter's cryogonal disperses with its melting, and a new cryogonal forms the following winter from entirely new snow with no material connection to the previous one, are these the same being or different beings? The question is identical in structure to the Ship of Theseus paradox, the question of whether a thing that has had all its components replaced remains the same thing. But Cryogonal's version is more radical. It does not merely replace its components, it dissolves entirely and is rebuilt from completely different material. What persists, if anything, is not material, it is pattern. The arrangement of crystals that constitutes a cryogonal is unique to each individual, and whether the same arrangement reconstitutes itself each winter, or whether each winter's arrangement is new, is something the entries do not specify. The mystery is structural. It cannot be resolved without information the world has chosen not to provide. Meloetta is a being whose entire form is organized around music, its body literally composed in musical notation, according to the entries, which state that its flowing hair resembles a musical staff, complete with notation. Its aria form is graceful and lyrical. Its pirouette form is percussive and rhythmic. The change between forms is triggered by song, by a specific melody that activates a biological transformation. Whether Meloetta experiences the change between its forms, as we experience a change in mood, as a shift in internal state that reorganizes how it relates to the world, or whether the transformation is purely physical with no accompanying phenomenological change, is another of the world's held open questions. Jigglypuff's relationship to music is already described in terms of the tragic asymmetry between singing and being heard. But Wigglytuff, its evolution, is described as having a body so elastic and soft that it inflates when it inhales, its fur so pleasant to the touch that other Pokemon are immediately drawn to. The connection between being sonically appealing and being physically appealing runs through the Wigglytuff line in a way that suggests the Pokemon world understands beauty as something experienced by multiple senses simultaneously, as a quality that does not belong to one register, but to the intersection of several. Primarina's singing is described as being used both to summon water balloons that it dances among and to communicate with other Primarina across long distances. The cultural transmission of songs within Primarina populations is specifically noted. The fact that different groups have developed different songs that are passed from generation to generation within those groups. This is not genetic variation. It is cultural variation, the same kind of regional dialect that develops within human language communities when groups are separated long enough that their inherited shared tradition begins to drift from each other. Primarina in different ocean regions have developed different songs, and these differences are maintained by cultural transmission rather than by evolutionary divergence. The songs are learned, which means they carry within them the specific history of the population that developed them. Shato is a Pokemon that can mimic human speech, not by reproducing sound mechanically, but by processing it through a vocal apparatus specifically adapted for this purpose. Its tongue is shaped to reproduce the range of sounds present in human language, and its brain is organized to hear and store the patterns that constitute speech. The mystery of Shato is not in the mimicry, but in what the mimicry means. When Shato produces a human phrase, is there anything behind it? Is the repetition an empty reproduction, or is there some representation in Shato's mind of the meaning the phrase carries? The entries do not venture into this, but the question of whether mimicry can shade into understanding through sufficient exposure and sufficient cognitive capacity is one that remains genuinely unresolved in real-world animal cognition research. The geography of the Pokemon world contains a mystery that is easy to overlook because it is so embedded in the basic structure of every game. The world is always simultaneously smaller than it should be and larger than it appears. Routes that take a few minutes to walk in-game are described in entries in lore as places of great expanse. Cities that consist of a few dozen buildings contain populations and institutions that would require much larger physical structures. This discrepancy is usually understood as a necessary compression, the game fitting its narrative into the time and space available to the player. But if the world is taken as a real place, as the lore consistently invites you to take it, then the geography becomes mysterious in a different way. Pokemon regions the size of small countries somehow contain full ecosystems with dozens of species occupying every ecological need. Routes between cities support populations of wild Pokemon dense enough for trainers to encounter them constantly. The forests are deep enough to hide secrets. The caves are extensive enough to require navigation. Professor Rowan in Sinnoh speaks of the mystery of Pokemon evolution in terms that suggest it remains genuinely unresolved in the academic tradition of the world. Evolution in the Pokemon world is not the same process as evolution in the real world. The speed at which it occurs, the completeness of the transformation, the fact that it can be deliberately triggered or deliberately delayed by the trainer's choice, all of these aspects distinguish it from the gradual process that biology describes. The Pokemon world uses the word evolution for something that is related to what biologists call evolution, but is also clearly distinct from it, and the entries acknowledge this strangeness without resolving it. The Battle Frontier and similar competitive institutions in the games represent the formal systematization of the trainer Pokemon relationship into organized competition, and within those structures, the depth of what a trainer and their Pokemon can achieve together becomes visible in ways that ordinary travel does not reveal. The Pokemon Battle Factory, where trainers use rented Pokemon rather than their own partners, tests whether strategic thinking can succeed without the emotional bond. The results suggest that it can to a degree, but that something is different, that the full expression of what a well bonded team can do is not achievable through strategy alone. The bond matters. The history matters. The specific relationship between this trainer and these Pokemon, accumulated over time through shared experience, produces something that cannot be replicated by strategic application of good Pokemon. This is perhaps the most fundamental mystery of all, the one that underlies every other aspect of the world, not how the cosmology works, not what Arceus is or what Mewtwo means, but what the relationship between a trainer and their Pokemon actually is, what its nature is, at the level where it matters most, at the level where it produces effects in battle and in the world that nothing else produces. The games tell you it is a bond. They show you its effects. They give you experiences of building it and experiencing what it enables. But the nature of the bond itself, what it is made of, how it works, what it means that a living being can enter into a relationship with another living being in which each becomes capable of things that neither could achieve alone, this is a mystery the games hold open, not as an oversight, but as the core of what they are about. This world has been built around this mystery. The gyms and the routes and the legendary encounters and the regional mythologies are all context for this central thing, all the material that surrounds and gives shape to the question of what can happen when two different kinds of beings choose each other and commit to going through the world together. The mystery does not resolve because resolution is not its purpose. Its purpose is to remain open, to remain the question that each new trainer answers in their own way, through their own journey, arriving at their own particular version of what it means, their own specific experience of what the bond is like when it is fully built and fully present. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play. As you close your eyes, you might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.